The first sequence this video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 551 Wanted Wengkonggang. Since Ren Xiaosu intercepted the laboratory data, life seemed to have calmed down. The whole barrier was calm. Except for the fact that Zhou also began to arrest Wengkonggang, nothing else seemed to make Ren Xiaosu happy. In the dead of night, Ren Xiaosu was alone in his hotel room, looking through the data of the Spark Company's research laboratory. He was quite curious about the Spark Company because he had faced the monsters cultivated by this company. The group of experimental subjects still lingered in the southwest wilderness. He didn't know when they would become a threat to humans again. If such a terrifying existence is not eradicated, it will probably bring great disasters in the future. So Ren Xiaosu was very curious about what the Spark Company was doing. However, when he was reading the information, he was shocked to find that it was not the same as the terrifying research he imagined. This life science laboratory was a serious research on anti-cancer targeted drugs. And looking at the background and significance of some papers, the research purpose of the Spark Company was to cure diseases and save lives, and there was no other idea. There was nothing anti-human in all the information. If Ren Xiaosu had only read these, he would have thought that Spark Company was an ordinary medical institution that cured diseases and saved lives. This was not the same as the Spark Company that Ren Xiaosu knew. Of course, it was not that Ren Xiaosu felt that Spark Company was a well-intentioned organization after reading the information, but he was thinking, why did Spark Company become what it is now after the disaster? It was difficult for Ren Xiaosu to have any good feelings about the Spark Company's wanton arrest of extraordinary people. Regardless of other things, at least Ren Xiaosu hated this matter. At this time, Ren Xiaosu suddenly saw another separate document. The content of the document was very short. It just said that Laboratory 039 had made a breakthrough in the treatment of cancer. The patient's mononuclear cells had all been transformed into binuclear cells and were extremely stable. It was just that the treatment conditions were extremely special and difficult to replicate. Ren Xiaosu was stunned for a moment. After the disaster, it seemed that there were still many cancer patients due to the subsequent effects of the radiation from the disaster. I didn't expect that Spark Company had already mastered the method of treating cancer before the disaster. But what did the other party mean by special treatment conditions? While Ren Xiaosu was reading the materials, Li Ran and other touring team members seemed to have just returned to the hotel after attending a dinner. Many people were drunk and shouting in the corridor, but this did not affect Ren Xiaosu. However, in the middle of the night, Li Ran came to knock on the door again, drunk. Ren Xiaosu simply pretended not to be in the room to have some peace and quiet. The next morning, Li Ran's assistant Fang Zhi came to invite Ren Xiaosu to go to the crew set together, saying that he was invited to visit together. Zhou Yingsu would definitely go. After all, Zhou Yingsu was Li Ran's bodyguard, but Ren Xiaosu really had no interest in going, so he refused directly. The idea of visiting together was probably from director Mu Wange, who wanted him to go to the crew as well. When Fang Zhi found that he could not invite Ren Xiaosu, he lied that Li Ran and Zhou Yingsu were in danger on the crew and asked him to go and help quickly. As a result, Ren Xiaosu glanced at him and closed the door without even paying any attention. I don't believe you. At this time, Huazian Company and Anjing Temple have all withdrawn. What dangers can there be in the barrier? Even Wengkonggang is probably far away. All the monsters and demons are keeping a distance from barrier number 73. It can be said that barrier number 73 is now one of the safest barriers in the world. It is not an exaggeration. At night, after the crew finished work, Mu Wange came to harass Ren Xiaosu personally. The theme that the other party always wanted to talk about was what role he wanted Ren Xiaosu to play. After Ren Xiaosu chased Mu Wange away, he asked Zhou Yingsu speechlessly, when will Li Ran leave for the next barrier? Zhou Yingsu said, according to the schedule, he should have left 2 days ago. After all, he will go to barrier number 74 in the west in 7 days. He came here just for an audition. As a result, due to some unexpected factors, the director suddenly became very enthusiastic about Li Ran. He even arranged a good role for Li Ran in the movie he is currently shooting. It is being filmed in a rush. Ren Xiaosu looked up at the ceiling. This so-called unexpected factor was probably himself. But when Zhou Yingxu mentioned the westernmost barrier number 74, Ren Xiaosu always felt a little uneasy, as if something bad was going to happen. However, this thought was just a flash for Ren Xiaosu, and he would definitely not use such unfounded things to persuade the crew to change the schedule. Of course, it was not completely without evidence, but Zhou's troops did not come to barrier number 73 first, but went to barrier number 74 to set up defense first, which made Ren Xiaosu feel very puzzled, as if Zhou knew what was going to happen at barrier number 74. Ren Xiaosu said to Zhou Yingxu, if something happens at barrier number 74, don't care about Li Ran and the others' wishes, just control them and take them away. Could it be that Zhou got some news, such as the Qing family was going to attack? After all, the Qing family was the closest to barrier number 74. Ren Xiaosu asked, so when do they plan to go to barrier 74? Isn't there a concert there? They have to prepare in advance, right? No need. The organizer will prepare it, Zhou Yingxu said. They plan to leave in 5 days. Ren Xiaosu looked at the ceiling. Did he have to endure harassment for another 5 days? He stood up and said to Zhou Yingxu, you stay here to protect her. I'm going to barrier 74 first. It's a good time to do some tasks and grab some mobile phones. I remember you said there is a black market at barrier 74. I'm going to sell a batch of mobile phones first. Zhou Yingxu was anxious. Master, are you leaving now? I told them that I can take you to the crew. Ren Xiaosu looked at Zhou Yingxu silently. Zhou Yingxu knew that he had said the wrong thing again. Director Mu promised me that if he pulled you into the crew, he would give me the leading role and let Li Ran play the supporting role. Ren Xiaosu was furious at the time. This Mu Wanji actually turned Zhou Yingxu against him. He looked at Zhou Yingxu with a look of regret. Do you really want to play the leading role? After saying that, Ren Xiaosu turned around and left. When he climbed out of the barrier, he remembered that he forgot to ask Zhou Yingxu where barrier 74 was. Moreover, all the vehicles were detained by Zhou's family, and he couldn't even drive the car. Walking in the wilderness, Ren Xiaosu became more and more angry, and he wanted to go back and beat up Mu Wanji, Zhou Yingxu, and Li Ran. As a result, at this moment, he heard the sound of an engine roaring on the road behind him. Ren Xiaosu looked back and saw that it was an off-road vehicle approaching. The vehicle stopped when it passed by Ren Xiaosu. A middle-aged man looked at Ren Xiaosu and smiled politely. Where are you going, young man? Why are you walking alone? Ren Xiaosu thought for a while and said, I'm going to barrier number 74. While speaking, Ren Xiaosu looked at the other party. There were only 2 men in the car, one middle-aged and the other a teenager who looked about the same age as him, like a father and son. But the middle-aged man smiled and said, it just so happens that we are going to barrier number 74 too. Come on up, we'll give you a ride. I have a fever, so there is only one update today. I will make up the remaining 2 after I recover. Sorry. Chapter 552 Teacher and Student. To be honest, this was the first time that Ren Xiaosu met someone willing to give him a ride in the wilderness. After all, everyone knew that the wilderness was not absolutely safe. As the saying goes, one must be on guard against others. If it were Ren Xiaosu, he would never let anyone take a ride. Of course, not many people dared to take his car. The middle-aged man smiled and said, since you are going to barrier number 74, it is also on the way, but we have to turn to a remote place on the way. If you don't mind, we will take you to barrier number 74. Ren Xiaosu was stunned for a moment, then smiled and said, okay, thank you. The young man in the co-pilot also said enthusiastically, hurry up and get in the car. Ren Xiaosu sat in the back seat. Suddenly, he listened to the music played on the tape in the car. Why did the singer's voice sound so familiar? After a few seconds, Ren Xiaosu realized that this was Li Ran's voice. Although he had never heard Li Ran's songs, this voice was easy to recognize. Suddenly, Ren Xiaosu didn't know what to say. He had obviously run out alone to avoid that woman, but he could still hear her songs when he came out. It was like a ghost was lingering. On the way, Ren Xiaosu found that the middle-aged man and the boy were not father and son. The boy kept calling him teacher, and it seemed that they were master and apprentice. The other party did not ask about his identity or why he was going to barrier 74. It seemed that he just wanted to give him a ride. However, the middle-aged man specifically said that he was going to a remote place to do something. This made Ren Xiaosu alert. What could be in a remote place? The whole wilderness was sparsely populated. Was it possible that he was going to a remote place to lead Ren Xiaosu into a trap? However, Ren Xiaosu did not speak. Instead, he asked calmly, "What are you two doing at barrier number 74? The middle-aged man on the other side smiled and said, "We are actually just passing by barrier number 74 and not going in. After we put you next to the barrier, we went into the mountains to collect herbs. It is the mountain range west of barrier number 74. Nowadays, there are few people in that mountain range, and there are many treasures growing naturally." Ren Xiaosu asked curiously, "Is it the legendary treasures from heaven and earth?" The storyteller told stories like the investiture of the gods. In those stories, treasures from heaven and earth are of great help to practitioners. Hearing Ren Xiaosu's question, the middle-aged man smiled and said, No, I'm talking about mountain products, ordinary herbs that can strengthen my apprentice's body." Ren Xiaosu nodded. It seems that the other party is a martial artist? There is an old saying that the poor study hard and the rich learn martial arts, because studying can change the fate of the poor, while the poor have no medicinal herbs to strengthen their bodies, so they can't practice martial arts at all. But did the other party go to the deep mountains and old forests just to collect herbs? Ren Xiaosu didn't believe it. In the afternoon, the off-road vehicle suddenly deviated from the main road and drove towards the more desolate wilderness. Ren Xiaosu sat calmly in the back seat, but there was no expression on his face. He just thought to himself that the other party might take action. Whether it was robbery or revenge, he might have been planning for a long time. After parking, the middle-aged man put his fingers in his mouth and whistled. Ren Xiaosu frowned. "Is there any help?" The next moment, there was a rustling sound in the woods next to him, and then 4 or 5 refugees who looked honest came out. These refugees said to the middle-aged man in surprise, "Old Li, you haven't been here for a while." "Okay, the medicines are all in the trunk, hurry up and take them down," the middle-aged man called Old Li said with a smile. "This time we brought antibiotics, which you need most in the wilderness." Ren Xiaosu, who was ready to kill at any time, was suddenly stunned. He thought that the other party brought him here to facilitate the other party's action, but it turned out to be to deliver medicine to the refugees. Ren Xiaosu knew what refugees looked like. He looked around the woods, but it was pitch black and he couldn't see anything. Old Li opened the trunk, and Ren Xiaosu saw 2 cardboard boxes in the trunk, which were simply sealed with tape. One of the men handed a basket of eggs to Old Li. "We don't have anything good here, just these eggs, you keep them." The eggs were as big as a fist, and they were obviously wild eggs that had evolved in the wilderness, which were completely different from the domestic chickens in the barrier. In the past 2 years, eating wild game has been particularly popular in the barrier. Whoever can treat others to a meal of wild game is very honorable. Ren Xiaosu was able to sell sparrows because the people in the barrier like them. However, no matter how expensive wild eggs are, they can't be more expensive than antibiotics. You have to know that medicines can save lives these days. But Lao Li did not refuse. He took the eggs and handed them to his apprentice beside him. "I am in a hurry to go to fortress number 74, so I will not eat with you today. Is there anything you need? I can bring you some when I come back from fortress number 74. A refugee hesitated and said, "It's time for winter. There are some children in the mountains who are not resistant to cold. Can you buy them some cotton clothes? If it's really inconvenient, forget it." Lao Li asked decisively, "How many pieces do you need?" 12 pieces. "Okay, I'll go to the market town of fortress number 74 later, and they sell them there," Lao Li said with a smile. The refugee rubbed his hands and smiled. "I'm so sorry to bother you all the time." "It's just a piece of cake," Lao Li said with a smile. "I wonder how much a cotton padded jacket costs in the market town now?" the refugee asked. "We still have some savings here." Lao Li pointed at the eggs in his apprentice's arms and said with a smile, "These pheasant eggs are very valuable, enough." After the matter was over, Lao Li took his apprentice back to the car. After the car started, Ren Xiaosu thought that these 2 people didn't look like colleagues selling medicine. A basket of pheasant eggs can only be exchanged for a cotton padded jacket at most. "I am quite familiar with the prices in the market town. Are you doing this purely for charity?" Ren Xiaosu asked. Old Li laughed as he drove. "We have a rule. When you become an adult, you need to go to the market town to see how the refugees live." I was arrogant at first, but after I arrived at the market town, I almost couldn't even get a meal. It was these refugees who gave me a bite to eat. Later, they couldn't stand the exploitation of the consortium and the fearful life in the market town, so they escaped. Ren Xiaosu nodded. So that's how it is. There are also honest people in the market town. Every place has someone who silently endures, which will further encourage the arrogance of those ruthless people, and finally they can't stand it and escape from the market town. Moreover, if you work for the consortium, you will only have one shack when you grow old. Nothing belongs to you. Even if you farm for the consortium, you are just paid. So some people would rather live a harder life in the wilderness, and hope that what they grow belongs to themselves. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelists. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 553, The 12th Night. At first, Ren Xiaosu thought that these two guys had taken him to this remote place to attack him, but he didn't expect that they were doing good things. But what was the other party's identity? Why did they have to go to the market town at a certain point to experience the life of refugees? First of all, the other party must be a person in the barrier, and whether it is a transcendent is yet to be determined. Ren Xiaosu observed that the other party walked steadily, and there was no flaw in his normal walking. It seemed that he was not an ordinary person. Lao Li looked at Ren Xiaosu and smiled. Are you a refugee? Ren Xiaosu nodded, yes. However, Ren Xiaosu did not explain anything else, because the more he said, the more mistakes he made. But Lao Li nodded, anyway, he doesn't look like a barrier person. The barrier people don't have the same eyes as you. Ren Xiaosu wondered, what kind of eyes did he have? Because of the delivery of medicine, they were delayed for half a day, so that in the evening of that day, they were still more than 100 kilometers away from the 74th barrier. Lao Li thought for a while and said, why don't we find a place to camp and set off for Barrier 74 early tomorrow morning? Sorry, we delayed your trip. Ren Xiaosu shook his head. I'm very grateful that you are willing to give me a ride. I don't know when I can reach Barrier 74 by myself. There was a pot on the back of Lao Li's off-road vehicle. When Ren Xiaosu went to help move the camping things, he found that the other party should have been in the mountains for quite a long time this time. He brought a lot of seasonings alone. He didn't know what the other party was going to do in the mountains to the west. Lao Li called his apprentice, Qin Sheng, you go and light the fire. I'm going to kill 2 rabbits. As he said that, Lao Li pulled out a dagger and went into the woods, leaving Qin Sheng to work swiftly alone. Ren Xiaosu watched from the side. Do you often go out in the wild? He asked because he saw that Qin Sheng was very skilled in cooking. You know, some people may not be able to light a campfire with a flint. It's purely because of inexperience. Qin Sheng smiled and said, I have been to many places with my teacher, read thousands of books, and traveled thousands of miles. Ren Xiaosu said nothing more. He always felt that these two people were a little mysterious. Qin Sheng had a dark complexion and a well-proportioned figure. He looked like a cheetah in the wilderness, very agile. Ordinary people would not have such a temperament. After Qin Sheng started the fire, he took a few branches and put a pot on the fire. He threw all the pheasant eggs he had obtained before into the pot. He smiled to Ren Xiaosu. Ordinary eggs will be cooked in 10 minutes if they are boiled in the shell, but these pheasant eggs need 15 minutes. The only difference is that the egg fragrance is far better than that of the domestic chickens in the barrier. They are delicious. At this time, Lao Li came back with 2 rabbits. He smiled and said, the pheasants have changed a lot in just a few decades in the wilderness, but the domestic chickens in the barrier have not changed at all. Let me say that we should tear down all the barriers and let the barrier people step out of their comfort zone. Only in this way can humans know what they will face in the future and become more adaptable to this world. Let the barrier people step out of their comfort zone. Ren Xiaosu recalled that the lives of those barrier people were not necessarily much better. He said to Lao Li, the barrier people are not comfortable either. Lao Li. The atmosphere was silent for 2 minutes, and Lao Li just didn't know how to continue the conversation. However, just when the pheasant eggs were cooked, there was a sound of a convoy moving in the distance. Ren Xiaosu could see the headlights of more than 10 cars swaying on the road. Ren Xiaosu looked at the convoy carefully, and then his face changed immediately. He turned to Lao Li and Qin Sheng and said, well, I'm not feeling well, so I'll leave first. Thank you for giving me a ride. He was about to run, but Lao Li shouted from behind him, take 2 eggs to eat on the way. As he spoke, Ren Xiaosu came back and directly took a pheasant egg from the pot and ran away. Lao Li and Qin Sheng frowned and watched him leave. Qin Sheng asked curiously, Teacher, who do you think he is? I don't know, but he's not simple, Lao Li said. He has a reserved temperament. He's not an ordinary refugee. He may be a transcendent. Then why did he run? Qin Sheng was puzzled. Maybe the convoy coming this time is here to hunt him down. Old Li was also puzzled. Is it related to what happened at Barrier 73 some time ago? You can ask your brother Kingxi when you go back. He was the one who followed the Spark Company to Barrier 73 at that time. Ask him if he has seen such a young man. The next moment, the speeding convoy stopped in front of the two of them. A woman rolled down the window and asked, Did you see a young man passing by here? Qin Sheng slowly opened his mouth. Are you? Li Ran. Li Ran found that he was recognized, and he was secretly happy. Ahem, yes, I am. As soon as he finished speaking, he was pushed away by the person next to him. Someone opened the car door and jumped out. Hello, my name is Mu Wanj, I am a director. Have you seen a young man passing by here? He's going to Barrier 74. These words made Qin Sheng and Old Li confused. Just now they thought that this convoy was chasing Ren Xiaosu, but now they found that it was not the case at all. Directors and female stars were chasing after him. What on earth was that young man doing? At this time, Ren Xiaosu was so angry that he almost cursed on the road. Did they say that they would leave in 5 days? How come this group of people chased him as soon as he left? They are really haunting. Wouldn't it be better to let him have 2 days of peace? It seems that men really can't be too handsome, otherwise there will be too many troubles, Ren Xiaosu thought seriously. Lao Li looked at Li Ran and Mu Wanj and smiled. Sorry, I didn't see it. Did we miss it on the road? Mu Wanj was puzzled. He didn't drive either. He shouldn't be running so fast. Keep chasing. He must have a way to get a car, Li Ran said. With that, the team set off again, leaving Lao Li and Qin Sheng in the wind. Teacher, why do you think they are chasing this boy? And he's a big star and director, Qin Sheng said speechlessly. Lao Li was silent for a while. I don't know. Strange things happen every year, especially this year. But teacher, is it appropriate for you to lie to them? Qin Sheng asked. It's impossible not to lie in this world. I taught you to be upright, but I never told you not to lie. Lao Li smiled and said, these two things are not contradictory. Really not contradictory. Qin Sheng began to wonder. Okay, don't think too much. Lao Li added a handful of wood to the campfire. Really, save your energy and find that cliff in the mountains. This is your last challenge. You will climb it with your bare hands without any protection. If you die, you will die in vain. If you survive, you will be the 12th knight. Only 2 chapters today. Chapter 554, The Key to New Species Order World. 61 has been very annoyed recently. Wang's barrier has always been very safe. The Order Department only needs to arrest criminals according to the instructions of artificial intelligence, so the Order Department has always been a relatively idle government office. In fact, they did not trust this so-called artificial intelligence at the beginning, but later everyone found that this artificial intelligence could infer who the suspect was based on surveillance alone, which was too powerful. For example, in a traffic accident, the accident car hit someone and then fled. As a result, this artificial intelligence judged the height and behavior habits of the other party based on the angle of the other party's car turning in the surveillance, because the vision in the car will be different for different heights. Gradually, the Order Department also got used to having artificial intelligence replace their investigation duties, and they were only responsible for arresting. After that, the criminals in Wang's barrier were arrested and sentenced. When the artificial intelligence was just online, the prison in Wang's barrier was almost unable to accommodate the prisoners. Originally, it was said that a larger prison would be expanded, but the Wang family's top management directly ordered the law department to impose heavy sentences. Overnight, more than 2,000 death row prisoners were added, and more than 1,000 were directly sent to special factories outside the barrier. In that kind of place, basically you can't come back for the rest of your life. This directly relieved the pressure on the prison. During that period, everyone was in danger. After all, those who stole items worth more than 1,000 yuan were directly sentenced to death, and street fights were also sentenced to death. Who would dare to commit a crime? However, during this period, the order department became busy again. Many people came to report that the guard dog was suddenly lost. This was not a matter of 1 or 2 families, but a matter of more than 10 families. The order department immediately thought, could it be that a dog thief came into the barrier? The target given by Wang to the order department was a 100% case-solving rate. If someone reported a case, it had to be solved, otherwise there would be no year-end bonus. The order department immediately sent people to several dog meat shops in the barrier and checked the surveillance outside the dog meat shops, but found nothing. Moreover, this time the artificial intelligence did not even give any information, which was also very abnormal. The order department dispatched a police dog, but when passing a street, the police dog suddenly broke free from the rope and ran away, and then the police dog was lost. This made the order department very angry. The director slammed the table and roared in the office. The order department immediately dispatched more manpower to conduct a carpet search of the place where the police dog broke free from the rope, and even the sewer was not spared. In the sewer, a team of the order department was walking on the smelly dirty water. Someone complained, "Why did you send us down? Wouldn't it be better to let the assistant come down to check?" "Don't talk, you lost the police dog. This is a disguised punishment. If you find the criminal, it's okay. If you can't find it, you're afraid you'll lose your job," said a person next to him. Suddenly, the person who spoke found that the person at the front of the team stopped and his body began to tremble. "What's wrong?" someone asked. The person at the front also said in a trembling voice, You look." Everyone looked forward with flashlights, and suddenly saw that the sewer in front was full of animal corpses, with bones piled up. Those corpses were piled up like a small mountain, most of which were rat skeletons, and some were cats and dogs. No wonder there was not a single rat in the sewer, someone said with a tingling scalp. At this time, the sound of dirty water waves sounded behind them, but when they looked back with horror, they found nothing. "There won't be monsters in the sewer." As soon as these words came out, all the members of the order department team ran out. Without catching the monster that devoured them as they imagined, the group returned to the ground safely. That afternoon, the order department sent more manpower to start checking the entire sewer, and found that there were as many as 9 piles of bones in the sewer. They also saw a police dog in one of them, but the police dog was just strangled to death and had not turned into bones. For a while, the whole fortress was saying that some monster might have entered the fortress and was hiding in the sewer. This incident made the whole fortress panic. People avoided manhole covers when walking on the road, fearing that they would be pulled down by something. This was a big deal, so it also alarmed the top management of the Wang family. Wang Shengzi even sent a superhuman to come, but also found nothing. At this time, the order department was holding a meeting to discuss. "Let's not talk about the arrest first. We have to determine what did this first, right? All these skeletons have been checked. There are no human skeletons, which means that the other party does not eat humans," said a man wearing gold-rimmed glasses. "I think it may be a mutant creature in the sewer, but we don't need to be too afraid. The other party does not eat humans. It may be smaller than humans, so it is more afraid of humans." However, at this moment, a person suddenly broke in from outside and said, "Oh no, someone from our order department is missing." Just after searching the sewer. At the bottom of East Lake, in the darkness, a group of fish were gathering at the place where the tunnel collapsed, greedily sucking the blood oozing from the stone pestle. No one thought that the hundreds of people who died in the tunnel would become a tonic for the fish in East Lake at this time, especially the blood of the extraordinary people in it, which almost drove the fish crazy. However, the broken stone pestle at the bottom of the lake was crowded with fish, as well as turtles, water snakes, frogs, crabs, and lake shrimps. A human tragedy became a feast for the creatures at the bottom of the lake, but it was difficult for them to touch the human corpses under the ruins. At this moment, the fish suddenly panicked and dispersed. It seemed that a huge monster came in the darkness. When it opened its mouth and swallowed, a large number of fish were sucked into its mouth. The fish in the East Lake were frightened by the newly arrived overlord and dared not approach, but they were reluctant to leave. The huge monster swam to the bottom of the lake and directly used its body to open a tunnel ruin, revealing the human corpse inside. The bottom of the water became turbid, and huge dust surged in the lake. However, the fish pounced on it like crazy, while the huge monster calmly picked its food. It seemed to only eat extraordinary people. The people from the order department of the number 73 fortress had set up a blockade on the shore of the East Lake, prohibiting the residents of the fortress from approaching, so no one saw the water under the lake surging wildly like boiling. After the huge black shadow had a full meal, it stayed quietly at the bottom of the lake, waiting for the next foraging. No one knew that, in the silence, the flesh and blood of the extraordinary human beings had become the key to open the door to the world of the new species order. It was a more dangerous and mysterious world. Chapter 555, Sharing Weal and Woe. Located at the westernmost part of the Zhou's fortress, Ren Xiaosu strolled down the street of Fortress Number 74. It was obviously not as prosperous as Fortress Number 73, and for some reason, Fortress Number 74 was under martial law, and the streets were full of military vehicles constantly moving. According to the news I read in the newspaper before, Zhou had mobilized 2 combat brigades to Fortress Number 74, so the number of troops here was over 10,000, but no one knew what was going to happen here and why Zhou mobilized so much. The commentator of the Hope Media analyzed that the closest here was the Qing family. The straight-line distance between Zhou and Qing was only more than 500 kilometers, but because of the mountain range, the two sides had never intersected in the past. Now Zhou's troops are stationed here, probably to guard against Qing. After all, Qing has unified the entire southwest and become the most powerful organization in the entire Fortress Alliance. At least in terms of the area of the occupied area, Qing controls the largest area of land. At this time, the atmosphere in the number 74 fortress was very tense, and the atmosphere of the residents of the fortress was very tense. Ren Xiaosu also saw that the patrol soldiers were searching the grain and oil stores one by one, and directly requisitioning the grain in the other store. However, the grain and oil store owners did not cry enraged. Grain and oil stores were Zhou's own property, and the shopkeepers were just Zhou's employees. At this time, all the grain was requisitioned, and they were happy to have some free time. Ren Xiaosu was walking on the street, and suddenly a team of patrol soldiers came and bumped into Ren Xiaosu. Just as they passed by, the patrol suddenly stopped Ren Xiaosu and asked in confusion, "Are you an adult? Let me see your residence ID card." Adult men must now accept temporary conscription and go to work. Ren Xiaosu is stunned on the spot. "I'm not an adult, I'm still young." "Then show me your residence ID card," the patrol said. Ren Xiaosu really didn't expect that he would encounter such a thing when he sneaked into the fortress. In the past, even if he went over the Wang's fortress, which was so strict, nothing happened. "Uncle, I'm really not an adult," Ren Xiaosu said. As he spoke, he looked around to see if there was a chance to run away. As soon as he finished speaking, the other party surrounded him. There were 7 or 8 patrol teams on the whole street. If a fight broke out here, he would probably be wanted by the whole city. The other patrol team did not even look at the ID card. The captain sneered, "You dare not let me see your ID card. You must be an adult but want to escape the temporary conscription. Take him away and take him to the construction site." As he said that, a group of people came over to push Ren Xiaosu, and one of them even took out handcuffs. Suddenly, a row of cars drove over from a distance on the street, and it seemed that they had just entered the barrier. When Ren Xiaosu saw the caravan, he felt bad. Isn't this the car of the tour team? The number 74 barrier is under martial law. Why did they let the tour team in? He found that this tour team was simply poisonous. No matter where he went, the other party could follow him. Of course, he didn't know that this was still Mu Wenji's face. In the Central Plains, celebrities like Mu Wenji and Li Ran would have a bit of face wherever they went, and the performance company in the barrier also came forward to help. If Li Ran couldn't come in, the show would be cancelled. After coming in, the performance company also specifically told him to stay in the hotel for the next few days and not go out. He didn't know what Zhou was crazy about. He was recruiting adult men in the barrier. If it weren't for the fact that the performance company bought a position in the barrier, he would have to go to the construction site to work. The performance company meant that they would hold a concert after this period was over. But Ren Xiaosu couldn't understand it. It looked like a war was about to break out in the barrier number 74. What kind of performance was there? Was it for the soldiers? The soldiers wouldn't pay for the tickets for the performance company. The people in the car obviously saw Ren Xiaosu, but the tour convoy had no intention of stopping. When the car passed by, Ren Xiaosu saw Li Ran's gloating expression through the car window, as if the other party had guessed why he was caught. Li Ran felt so happy. She was a star, and she went to knock on Ren Xiaosu's door in the middle of the night to throw herself into his arms, but she was knocked unconscious. The second time, he simply refused to open the door for her. How could she tolerate this? So now Li Ren was so happy to see Ren Xiaosu being temporarily recruited to work at the construction site. Ren Xiaosu watched the convoy passing by, and Li Ren made a face at herself in the car. Ren Xiaosu said to the patrol team beside him, "Do you have the task of recruiting workers? You need to complete the indicators given to you by the leader." "Stop talking nonsense," said the captain of the patrol team, "nothing you say will work now." Ren Xiaosu suddenly pointed at the convoy and shouted, "I saw a lot of adult men in the windows of that convoy." Feng Zhi. The patrol team looked back at the vehicles and asked other soldiers, "Do you recognize these cars? Are they from some big shot on the barrier?" "No, I know all the big shots cars, and I can even recite the license plate numbers," someone said. As a result, 10 minutes later, Feng Zhi and others followed Ren Xiaosu and were forced to go to the construction site together. In the entire tour team, only Mu Wanj was not arrested, and the rest were all detained by the patrol troops. If it were an ordinary troop, they would probably not do this. However, the commander of the combat brigade responsible for patrolling the barrier was a direct descendant of the Zhou family. How could he take the actors and directors seriously? Besides, the director and actors were not touched, but only a few staff members were recruited. What's more, the commander of the Zhou combat unit once wanted to invite an actress to dinner through Mu Wanj, but Mu Wanj ignored him. In the eyes of the troop commander, he was very polite for not touching Mu Wanj this time, mainly because he was worried that he would be on the entertainment headlines of the Hope Media newspaper tomorrow. Ren Xiaosu thought as he walked that the Zhou family must have encountered a very terrible enemy, otherwise they would not be so crazy. He found that even the soldiers were a little nervous. But what kind of enemy is the Zhou family facing? Li Ren was stunned when he saw Feng Zhi being taken away to work as a migrant worker. Zhou Yingsu was laughing beside him. She knew very well that her master would never tolerate others watching him laugh when he was in trouble. Feng Zhi was almost crying beside Ren Xiaosu. "It was Li Ren who laughed just now. I didn't laugh. Who did I offend?" Before leaving, Ren Xiaosu also explained to Zhou Yingsu, "Find the best hotel in the whole fortress to stay in, so that he could find landmarks after escaping from the construction site. This fortress number 74 might be in chaos, so it's best not to wait in the muddy water here. Also, ask around to see what is going to happen in fortress number 74. There are still 2 updates today, and I owe 4 updates. I'm a little panicked. Period. Chapter 556 Investigative Reporter. The patrol team escorted Ren Xiaosu, Feng Zhi and others all the way to the edge of the rampart. At this time, the redundant residential houses had been demolished and new fortifications were being built inside the rampart. Originally, this was a clean and tidy street with small shops and 5- or 6-story-old residential buildings on the roadside. Now, the residential buildings and shops are gone, replaced by dust all over the ground, half-built bunkers, and some simple machine gun commanding heights. This kind of fortification is completely to prevent how to fight after the rampart wall is breached. Moreover, the city gates have been sealed. Why is the gate also sealed? Feng Zhi said in surprise, "We came in from the east gate this morning, and it hasn't been sealed yet. They are located on the north side of the rampart. The rampart has a total of 4 gates, and the gate on the north side has been completely sealed with materials such as concrete." Ren Xiaosu took a look and found that the material was not yet dry. It seems that it was just sealed in the past 2 days. No one in the patrol team answered them, and Ren Xiaosu was thinking, this might really be a war, otherwise why would they seal the gates when they have nothing to do? I'm afraid that in the entire fortress, only the east gate is not sealed now. It seems that the enemy is coming from the west, so only the east gate is left in Zhou's number 74 fortress. When they arrived at the construction site, what Ren Xiaosu and his team did was to move bricks and assist the professional engineering corps in building fortifications. While moving bricks, Ren Xiaosu observed what the Zhou troops were doing. The first was to transport materials for centralized custody. Generally, when doing this, they were preparing for a hard war. The second was to place induction mines in the rivers passing through the fortress. It seemed that they had specially transported this thing from other fortresses. There are many rivers and lakes in the Zhou territory, many plains in the Wang territory, and the Kong territory is connected to the sea. This is the topographical feature of the three major consortiums, so the Zhou family has done a lot of research on weapons in the water. To be honest, Ren Xiaosu looked for a long time and didn't understand. What exactly is this to defend? The defense work is so strict. Ordinary troops should not enter the fortress through the water, right? While working, Ren Xiaosu did not feel tired at all. Compared with his physical fitness, this level of work intensity was nothing. On the other hand, Feng Zhi and the others were so tired that they wanted to die. On the way to get lunch at noon, Feng Zhi was holding the plastic lunch tray distributed by Zhou, and his hands were shaking. Feng Zhi complained, "Ren Xiaosu, can you be more humane, huh? Didn't you just smile in the car? Is it necessary for you to be so? No, you work too, how come you don't look tired at all?" Ren Xiaosu glanced at him, "You don't do any work at ordinary times, and when the danger comes, you guys won't be able to run. Letting you exercise is for your own good. Is that human language?" Feng Zhi was speechless. The Central Plains is so safe now, and we haven't even seen wild beasts in the wilderness. Where does the danger come from? Ren Xiaosu pointed to the ground. "Isn't this barrier number 74 facing danger?" Feng Zhi glanced at the dense fortifications around him, and it seemed to be true. He asked curiously, "What is going on? Is the Qing family going to attack?" "I don't know." Ren Xiaosu shook his head. "Insufficient information, no way to judge." The next moment, a person in the crowd was suddenly pulled out by the manager of the construction site, and the small filming equipment hidden in the other person's pocket was snatched away. "What are you doing?" The person who was pulled out said proudly, "I am an investigative reporter. I came to record what you are doing. You recruited the residents of the fortress as migrant workers without any intention of settling wages. As a result, the manager of the construction site stopped the reporter and invited him to the side of the shed. He was given a better meal, but the reporter's filming equipment was taken away." Ren Xiaosu and Feng Zhi watched from a distance, and saw that the manager actually sent someone to get a red envelope and handed it to the reporter. The reporter accepted it directly and never mentioned the investigation again. Feng Zhi adjusted his glasses. "This is definitely not an investigative reporter from Hope Media. He is not tough at all. A red envelope solved it." Ren Xiaosu asked curiously. "This reporter came here with the intention of blackmailing. There are many reporters like this in Songyun. They went to investigate some of his chaos just to collect red envelopes," Feng Zhi explained. "I see. What about Hope Media?" "From what you said, Hope Media is a little different." Ren Xiaosu asked. "The editor-in-chief of Hope Media used to be an investigative reporter," Feng Zhi said admiringly. "He hid in the coal mine of the Kong group and recorded the treatment of the coal miners. He was beaten several times because of this. When he escaped back, he wanted to report what he saw and heard, but no newspaper dared to take it. Until this time, he went to find Suke of King Group. At that time, Suke had just taken over King Group. It was said that Suke and the editor-in-chief hit it off at first sight. Suke said, since no newspaper dared to report, then we should set up a newspaper to report. That's how Hope Media was born." Ren Xiaosu listened with relish. Feng Zhi on the side continued to sigh. "Of course, this is just a story that came out from nowhere, but Hope Media has always been tough in doing things. Hey, I have a press card too." Feng Zhi came to his senses at this time. He had applied for a press card before, but of course he didn't do it to be a reporter, but to be Li Ran's assistant. It would be easier to do things with an extra reporter identity. Many celebrities' assistants have a lot of identities, all of which were bought. Feng Zhi searched in his wallet. He could show his press card and not have to work. Putting aside other things, not having to work was the most important thing. Feng Zhi pulled out a card with his photo on it from his wallet, and shouted to the person in charge of the construction site, "Me too." But before he could finish his words, his press card was taken away by Ren Xiaosu. "No, you're not." Feng Zhi. Ren Xiaosu explained in a low voice, "I'm going to take you back to the barrier to find Li Ren and the others tonight. You're being taken away alone, and when we leave, you'll be the only one left on the construction site. Are you willing?" Feng Zhi was skeptical. "You want to take us away? Do you think I want to work here? Don't worry, the barrier is so big, even if we run away, Zhou won't have the energy to search the whole city for us." Ren Xiaosu glanced at him, but before we go, there's still things to do. As far as Ren Xiaosu could remember, the supplies the touring team brought were enough for everyone to eat for 2 days at most, and it was obvious that a war was going to break out in barrier number 74, and all the food was in the hands of the troops. If they didn't get some supplies, the entire touring team would probably starve in 2 days. Chapter 557. Only faith and the sun and moon are eternal. Between the towering mountains in the west, the traces of human civilization were completely wiped out by plants. Lao Li took Qian Sheng to the mountains in the early morning. The two quickly shuttled through the ups and downs of the mountains. The mountains and forests were like flat land to them. When the two arrived at a canyon 6 or 7 meters wide at a very fast speed, they jumped over it like cats without blinking. This kind of canyon seemed to be ignored by them. Every time at this time, Qian Sheng would have a heroic spirit of conquering nature in his heart. But the teacher always told him that nature could not be conquered by humans. What the knight had to do was to blend into nature and become a unique creature in nature. Just like what Lao Li said to Ren Xiaosu, he always suggested that humans go out of the barrier so that they can adapt to this world, otherwise they will only be eliminated. He did it himself. Slowly, the two of them were getting closer to the target location. Qian Sheng's physical strength was gradually consumed. Lao Li stopped and smiled. You are not a real knight yet. You have to save your physical strength. The vertical cliff you have to climb with your bare hands this time is 600 meters high. It is not an easy thing to climb up. Teacher, do we have to climb so high? Qian Sheng smiled bitterly. There are no protective measures. If you fall down, you will be dead. Lao Li didn't care at all. How can you, a knight disciple, be afraid of death? This is a belief. Besides, this height of 600 meters was summarized by the previous knights. Why not climb 500 or 700? Just 600 can open the shackles of your body, so I didn't let you climb more. You must know that the knight climbed more than 900 meters. His glory is beyond the reach of you and me, but the height of 600 meters cannot be less, not even a meter less. The knight mentioned by Lao Li is the founder of King Group, and now the Knights organization is full of believers of the Knights. They regard conquering nature and blending into nature as their own beliefs, and regard the Knight as their own beliefs, and have been looking for the descendants of the Knight. The so-called secret of the Knight to open the gene lock of the body lies in the process of conquering nature and blending into nature. That is the mysterious 8 challenges. Among them, the powerful surge is mountain cross-country. There is also the birth of the sky, which is skydiving. The creatures of water are extreme surfing. The surge of wind is wingsuit flying. Now Qian Sheng has only one left, gravity, 600 meters of unprotected freehand rock climbing. In fact, the Knights organization does not mind if someone in the outside world knows this secret, they just haven't publicized it. These 8 challenges must be completed by ordinary people to completely open the shackles in the body. In this process, if it is not for extreme love and faith, it is impossible to complete the 8 challenges. If someone completes it, they will naturally become new Knight believers, because after they complete these 8 challenges, they will see the light of the Knight and understand that there is another mountain outside of life. Each of these 8 challenges is like a gate of hell. You have to survive 9 deaths to cross these thresholds. Lao Li looked at Qian Sheng's young face, full of vigor, just like himself 15 years ago. Now he is 38 years old and no longer young. Although the functions in his body make him always strong after opening the gene lock, his state of mind is destined to be different. The other Knight members are probably similar to him. Everyone's current wish is nothing more than to find the descendants of the Knight. They don't have the opportunity to meet the Knight, but they want to see the others' descendants and see if they have the style of the Knight back then. Old Li looked at the 600-meter cliff in front of him and sighed. In recent years, we feel that there may not be new Knights in the future. After you, some people have challenged wingsuit flying, but they were attacked by birds in the air. Various consortiums have also given up on airplanes as a tool, and skydiving has become a swan song. The most difficult thing is surfing. It is said that people have often seen huge monsters swallowing ships at Kong's beach recently. Even going out to sea has become a difficult task, let alone surfing. Not to mention the difficulty of the challenge itself, the conditions for completing it are more demanding than before. If you can't reach the sky, how can you skydive? During the skydiving process, you may be attacked by birds. This is not a matter of 9 deaths, but a matter of 10 deaths. So when Qian Sheng started the challenge, someone in the organization foresaw that these situations might happen, so they trained Qin Sheng to complete other challenges first. The two passed through the woods, and a smooth cliff suddenly appeared in front of them. Old Li looked at the cliff in a trance. He also climbed up from here that year. Old Li smiled and said, "When my uncle brought me here, I had the same idea as you. Is this a cliff that humans can climb? It's definitely not possible, but the fact is that I did it. Go, Qin Sheng, complete your last challenge and become the last knight." Qin Sheng took off his heavy autumn clothes and changed into the climbing shoes, vest and shorts that the two of them brought with him. He put a bag of magnesium powder on his waist. The magnesium powder is to increase the friction between the palms and the rock wall to prevent the palms from being slippery after sweating. Old Li smiled and said, "Do you remember what I said to you?" Qin Sheng glanced at Old Li and said, "Remember. Only faith and the sun and the moon are eternal." After speaking, Qin Sheng turned around and walked towards the mountain. The sun at noon in autumn was not poisonous at all, but made people feel a little warm in the cold wind. Under normal circumstances, such freehand rock climbing requires familiarity with the route in advance. The climber must be lowered down little by little from the top of the mountain with a rope. Not only must the route be familiarized, but the gravel on the rock wall must also be cleaned. However, many knights have already climbed this cliff. Qin Sheng can even see the subtle traces on the cliff, judging which route these knights climbed back then, as if the predecessors were pointing the way for him. At this moment, Qin Sheng looked back at Lao Li, as if those knights who had once been brilliant were standing behind him and smiling at him. Climbing up the cliff, Qin Sheng's movements were as brisk as a monkey, but when he reached a height of more than 100 meters, Qin Sheng began to feel his physical strength being consumed at an accelerated rate. He stood there, his arms clamped in the cracks of the rock wall to catch his breath and rest, looking up at the cliff above his head, as if he could never see the end. At this moment, Qin Sheng saw someone engrave a line of small words on the cliff next to him. Zhang Qingxi stayed. Thinking about it, this should be the place where Brother Qingxi rested back then. Qin Sheng smiled, adjusted his breathing, and continued to climb up. At this time, those knights seemed to be climbing to the top with him. Old Li at the foot of the cliff also stretched his body, and began to climb up with a bundle of ropes on his back. However, for a knight like Old Li, climbing such a cliff was no longer a difficult task. It was more like reminiscing about his youth. Chapter 558 Lonely City. Freehand rock climbing is one of the most physically demanding sports in extreme sports. Qin Sheng took 7 breaks during the climbing process, and every time he could see the words left by his predecessors at the resting position. Those names were like warm greetings and silent power as he climbed to the top. Lao Li followed behind Qin Sheng, neither fast nor slow. For Lao Li, he did not enjoy the joy of climbing to the top, but the pleasure of finding the names of those old friends. When he went back and saw those old friends, he had new things to talk about. "You took 8 breaks when you were climbing, you are a bit bad." This is not Lao Li's bad taste alone, but all knights who have been in this organization for a long time will develop this bad habit. When Qin Sheng climbed to the last 10 meters, his arms began to tremble, but Lao Li shouted from below, "Climb up, if you fall down now, there will be no new knights in the future." As soon as the voice fell, Qin Sheng roared and continued to climb up. At this time, several hours had passed, and the midday sun had gradually set in the west and was falling behind the cliff. The wind started to blow in the mountains. The wind from nowhere blew the clothes of the two people. Qin Sheng climbed up all the way, as if he was chasing the fading afterglow. Lao Li did not help him, because every knight had to walk his own way. I remember that when the knight just established this organization, he once said to an old senior, "I will only accompany you for 1,000 miles, and from now on, I will no longer ask about the wind, snow and sunshine." At this time, Qin Sheng's right palm had already grasped the edge of the cliff. He used his last strength and used his right hand as a leverage point to pull his whole body up. He was just lying on the top of the cliff, panting violently, and suddenly saw the top of the cliff with dense inscriptions. There were names behind each sentence: Zhang Qingxi, Li Yungayan, Wang Xianwu, Wen Meng, Wu Dengyan, Luo Yongxin, Su Ke. There were as many as 32 familiar names. Li Yungayan is Lao Li's real name, and the name Su Ke surprised Qin Sheng. To be honest, no one in the outside world probably knows that Su Ke is also a member of the Knight. Only those who have been to the top of this mountain can see this name clearly engraved here. Everyone engraved the same words: only faith and the sun and the moon are eternal. Qin Sheng was suddenly stunned. He found that someone in the front had engraved 4 big characters, but did not leave a signature. Forever young. It was these 4 words, which were extremely abrupt. Qin Sheng suddenly turned back to look at Lao Li, who had just reached the top. Did that knight die in the disaster? Lao Li smiled and shook his head and said, I don't know, I really don't know. Qin Sheng looked back at the 4 words forever young. This cliff was found by the knight predecessors after the disaster as the most suitable place to challenge, but why did the 4 words forever young appear here? The names of the knights of all generations have been signed here, but the forever young has not been signed. In fact, this knight organization is not 32 knights. If that person is counted, there should be 33. Old Li said on the side, your scenery should not only be in front of you. The young Qin Sheng suddenly looked up at the western sky. The light of the setting sun was shining through the distant clouds. The magnificent clouds suddenly became clear, and the golden light was like a sea of light. At this moment, there was a sudden click in the body of the young Qin Sheng, and Old Li smiled with relief. It seemed that some shackles in Qin Sheng's body were opened, and the huge and abundant power swept through his body like a torrent. Old Li smiled and said, Qin Sheng, the last night. But suddenly, gunshots were heard in the mountains in the distance. Old Li and Qin Sheng turned their heads to look. After the gunshots, there were human screams and wails. I don't know who is fighting in this mountain. Is it that the Qing family and the Zhou family are fighting? The next moment, a gray figure climbed to the top of another mountain. The movement was so fast that Old Li frowned. The opponent's physical strength might be comparable to that of a knight. The gray figure stood on the opposite mountain top. He had no hair, not even eyebrows. He just stared at Lao Li and Qin Sheng quietly, his eyes like a normal and cold human. This description may not be accurate, because in Lao Li's eyes, except for the slightly different skin color, the other things are the same as humans. Experimental subject. Lao Li's mind immediately flashed this word. They had heard of experimental subjects. After all, experimental subjects had been making trouble in the southwest for a long time. But Lao Li couldn't figure it out. This is the Central Plains. Why did the experimental subject suddenly run here? And wasn't it said that the experimental subject crawled on the ground, like a reptile? Why was the experimental subject in front of him so special, and his eyes also contained the same emotional expression as humans? Lao Li stood up and confronted the other party, but the other experimental subject actually smiled at Lao Li and went down the mountain, as if he came to the top of the mountain just to take a look at them. After the other party left, Lao Li immediately fixed the rope on his back on the top of the mountain. Leave here quickly and tell Zhou the news of the arrival of the experimental subjects. If the number 74 barrier is not prepared, I am afraid that the people of the entire barrier will suffer. In just a moment, Lao Li seemed to see the scene of the residents of the barrier wailing, which was probably a scene that no human wanted to see. Just before going down the mountain, Lao Li looked back and saw that the densely packed experimental subjects were rushing madly between the valleys in the distance. The number of them all over the mountains was probably nearly 10,000. Even a well-informed person like Lao Li felt his scalp tingling. How could the number of experimental subjects become so large? We can only pray that the defenders of number 74 barrier are enough. Lao Li and Qin Sheng ran towards the number 74 barrier, but Qin Sheng's joy of becoming a knight had disappeared. When they got to the bottom of the rampart, Lao Li did not hide his identity as a knight, and then informed Zhou's troops that there were many experimental subjects following behind him, and the number was extremely large, and the conservative estimate was 6,000. But before they could say a few words, Zhou's troops suddenly received news that the combat brigade that came here from the number 73 rampart to support them was ambushed by the experimental subjects. At this time, more than half of them were killed or wounded, and they were on their way back to the number 73 rampart. Because it was dark, this combat brigade could not even figure out the number of experimental subjects that ambushed them. Before there was accurate intelligence, the troops of the number 73 rampart could only wait for more troops to gather and come to support. In other words, the number 74 rampart would be an isolated city for at least 7 days. Lao Li said seriously, the test subjects behind us can't run faster than us, so this is another group of test subjects who ambushed your troops, one from the east and one from the west, attacking the barrier. If this is true, then we must be prepared. The number of test subjects may exceed 10,000. Finally resumed the 3 updates. Please bear with me for a while. Chapter 559, Go or Not. It was already evening when Lao Li and Qin Sheng finished climbing barehanded, and it was late at night when they returned to Barrier 74 to report the news. When the news of the attack on Barrier 73 came back, all the Zhou troops were silent. Lao Li asked, "Since Qing had already passed the news to you, why didn't you send more troops?" As a result, the commander of Zhou's troops stationed at Barrier 74 replied, "We originally wanted to mobilize more troops, but didn't Barrier 73 happen to have an accident? Who could have thought of this? If it weren't for the fall of Donghu at Barrier 73, the reinforcements would have come a long time ago." Lao Li suddenly fell silent, because in fact, their knights were also involved in this matter. Although only one person went, they participated after all. So if we really have to say it strictly, all the people with ulterior motives in Barrier 73 that day were accomplices of this experimental subject. Of course, Lao Li would think so, but others would not. For example, Ren Xiaosu felt that this was caused by Hozhong and Nanjing Temple, and had nothing to do with him. At midnight, it was time to go to bed, but Zhou's troops pulled all the soldiers to the fortifications, leaving only a small number of them to rest. The intelligence that Qing gave Zhou said that when they were facing only a few thousand experimental subjects, they were already in a headache. The skin and muscles were so strong that even bullets could not penetrate them, and heavy machine guns were necessary. But the opponent's speed was extremely fast, and it was easy for them to get into the blind spot of your shooting vision. The reaction nerves of ordinary soldiers could not keep up with their movement. When the speed and strength exceeded 2 or 3 times, ordinary troops on the battlefield would feel like they were being crushed. It was as if ordinary troops were slowed down, while the opponent was at normal speed. If they fought like this, they would suffer heavy losses even with hot weapons. Although you can kill many experimental subjects, they don't care about casualties at all. They took your fortress and directly used your residence to make up for its losses. Old Li glanced at Qin Sheng and said, "Originally, after you became a knight, you should immediately go to a market town and stay there for a year. You can't use your abilities, or even the wilderness survival skills I taught you. But now, at this critical moment, you should first help the Zhou family defend against foreign enemies with me." Qin Sheng nodded. He understood the importance of the matter. At this time, there were not many people in the market town outside the barrier. Even the refugees moved into the barrier to build fortifications. This was probably the first time for the refugees to enter the barrier, but they were also given anklets that could be used for positioning. When the war was over, these refugees would be taken out. At this time, Ren Xiaosu was quietly moving to the periphery of the construction site with Feng Zhi and others. He whispered, "Do you have any valuables on you?" Feng Zhi nodded. "We have collected 30,000 in cash and 5 watches. When he spoke, Feng Zhi had a painful expression on his face. You know, his watch was very expensive. It cost more than 200,000 when he bought it. As a result, Ren Xiaosu first exchanged his watch for a bunch of food. The officer in charge of the food almost laughed his head off. Anyway, these snacks were not his own, but Zhou's. Why not exchange a little food for a famous watch? They exchanged for more than 10 bags of food, which was enough for all of them to eat for at least half a month. However, Ren Xiaosu did not put them into the storage space, and let Feng Zhi and the others carry them. Then, Ren Xiaosu took the remaining 30,000 cash and 5 watches and asked the person in charge of the construction site to let them go. The officer in charge of the construction site also specifically said, "Don't go out after you go home. If you are caught again, even the gods can't do anything." There are more than 2,000 people on the construction site where Ren Xiaosu and his team are. There are so many workers that they have no place to live and can only sleep on the ground. So if there are 10 people missing, no one will notice. Feng Zhi felt very unbelievable when he walked out of the construction site. "You came out so soon? You let us out so soon?" Ren Xiaosu glanced at him and said, "We just arrested you to do the work, not to line you up for execution. There are so many people working, we don't need a few of us, and the private troops are guarding the construction site. What kind of discipline can these private troops have?" In recent years, various consortiums have been slowly reducing the establishment of private troops. Maybe in a few years, this abnormal existence will disappear. According to Zhang Jinglin, at the beginning, the managers of the barriers were elected. The consortium was not strong at that time. Some managers had troops in their hands and could even compete with a consortium. But gradually, The consortium became more and more powerful, and the status of the managers became weaker and weaker. The private troops were just a fig leaf for the managers, and they were corrupted by the consortium's addictive cigarettes. Now, the consortium has begun to directly replace the managers, just like Luolan did not have any official position in the number 113 barrier at the beginning, but only managed the entire barrier secretly. Now, the consortium has taken over all the barriers openly, so there is no need for private troops to exist. Many officers in the private army also realized this. They knew very well that the consortium would not want such waste, so they just made as much money as possible and lived a good life. A group of people walked stealthily on the street, and from time to time they had to follow Ren Xiaosu to avoid the passing military vehicles. It took 2 hours to get to the hotel where Li Ren and his friends were staying. Along the way, Ren Xiaosu always felt that something was wrong tonight. This fortress was particularly lively, as if a fight was going to start tonight. After entering the hotel, Li Ren and others sat in the hotel lobby. Li Ren wanted to go back to the room, but Zhou Yingsu insisted on sitting in the lobby. She said that Ren Xiaosu could not stay on the construction site for too long, and might escape as soon as it got dark. Sure enough, Zhou Yingsu rushed over happily when she saw Ren Xiaosu, but was driven back by the smell of sweat from the group of people. Li Ren pinched his nose. Hurry up and take a shower. How can I have the energy to take a shower? Ren Xiaosu frowned and said, pack your things, we have to leave the barrier tonight. Why leave the barrier? Li Ren exclaimed, we just got here, and the concert hasn't even started yet. Ren Xiaosu glanced at her, really not knowing the importance of the matter. Why are they still holding a concert at this time? He said to Zhou Yingsu, use your ability to dig a tunnel outside the wall, we will leave through the tunnel. Tunnel. Feng Zhi was puzzled, how wide is the tunnel? 1 person wide. Ren Xiaosu looked at Feng Zhi. Then what about our speakers and musical instruments? Feng Zhi exclaimed, those musical instruments, a trumpet costs hundreds of thousands. These words made Ren Xiaosu confused, are musical instruments so expensive? The 10 Wang clan soldiers in plain clothes said, I don't think we need to leave. Even if the Qing clan attacks, they won't do anything to the residents of the fortress. We can just stay in the hotel and don't be afraid. When the time comes, I will negotiate with them as a Wang clan officer. They will definitely be willing to let us go. After all, the Qing clan will not offend the Wang clan after going to war with the Zhou clan. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 560, Experimental Subject Attack. The plainclothes soldier spoke with reason and evidence, and the main point was that Ren Xiaosu didn't need to listen to him. And he really convinced the others. Feng Zhi held Zhou Yingsu and said, I think they are right. We don't need to leave at this time. If the Qing family calls here, it will be fine if the officer of Wang family goes to negotiate with them. There is no need for the Qing family to be enemies with the entire Central Plains. Feng Zhi didn't say this to Ren Xiaosu, but to Zhou Yingsu, because Ren Xiaosu was Zhou Yingsu's assistant and must listen to Zhou Yingsu. But when Ren Xiaosu heard what the other party said, he was furious. If it was really the Qing family that called, it would be fine. He was afraid that the enemy coming was not the Qing family. If it was the Qing family that occupied the number 74 barrier, then Ren Xiaosu would have no chance to run away. He could walk sideways in the barrier, right? At that time, there would be no need for the Wang family officer to negotiate. Ren Xiaosu himself was an active officer of the Qing family, right? At the 313th position, Ren Xiaosu helped Qing Zhen get the defense map, and helped Luolan so much. Luolan said that he would get him a major general for fun, but Ren Xiaosu refused sternly, saying that he didn't want the official position, but would be paid later. Luolan said that it was for him anyway, and he could take the position whenever he wanted. Ren Xiaosu looked at the plainclothes officers who were so confident, as if they had a say in front of the Qing family. What Ren Xiaosu feared most was that it was not the Qing family that came. After all, Luolan had just made friends with the Zhou family, and he knew that Qing Zhen was not a person who liked to initiate wars. If the Zhou family did not declare war on the Qing family, Would Qingzhen have nothing better to do and let the soldiers trek 500 kilometers of mountain roads to the central plains? What a joke. At this moment, a bell suddenly rang in the number 74 fort. Ren Xiaosu was stunned. He asked Zhou Yingsu, "Does the bell in the central plains mean the same as the bells in the southwest and northwest?" Zhou Yingsu whispered, "The same meaning, the fort is in danger." But he saw a patrol team driving by outside, and there was even a loudspeaker on the car shouting, "All residents of the fort are at home, and are not allowed to go out without permission. If you encounter unidentified creatures, please call Zhou's troops as soon as possible. The landline number is 077. The homes of the residents of the fort basically have landlines, the kind with wires, which Ren Xiaosu and his team used when they opened the medicine shop. When Ren Xiaosu heard what the other party said, his face darkened. He looked at Li Ran and the plainclothes soldiers. "No need to leave, we can't leave." Ren Xiaosu probably guessed what was attacking the number 74 fort. Apart from the terrifying thing like the experimental subject, there is probably nothing that can make a consortium so afraid and as if facing a great enemy. If there is really an experimental subject outside the fort, then going to the wilderness now is the most dangerous. As for what the plainclothes soldiers said, no matter who breaks in, they will not touch the residents of the fortress. This is even more nonsense. The experimental subject is the kind that wants to massacre the city. Seeing Ren Xiaosu's serious face, Zhou Yingsu hurriedly asked, "What is coming?" Ren Xiaosu looked at Zhou Yingsu. "You are also from the southwest, so you must have heard of the experimental subject." Zhou Yingsu's face turned pale. "You know, the experimental subject has destroyed several fortresses in the southwest." Then Zhou Yingsu said to Li Ran, "Your mission only requires us to protect you. Now you come with us. If you want to live, don't worry about others." Li Ran was a little panicked. She looked at Ren Xiaosu. Ren Xiaosu didn't say anything, just frowned and thought about something. The plainclothes soldier next to him was unhappy after hearing what Zhou Yingsu said. "We invited you here just for a face. Do you really think Miss Ranran needs your protection? She is with us, no one can hurt her, we are active soldiers." Zhou Yingsu looked at him coldly. "Now even your guns have been taken away by Zhou, what can you use to protect Li Ran? And whether you have ever been on a real battlefield is also a question." However, at this moment, Li Ran asked Zhou Yingsu, "Is it really that scary? I will pay more, can you protect all of us?" The plainclothes officer stopped him and said, "Why should we pay them more? She is just a superhuman, and we didn't even see her use superhuman abilities on the way. Maybe she is just a show-off." Li Ran didn't listen to what he said, but continued to ask Zhou Yingsu, "Can I pay more?" But to Li Ran's surprise, Zhou Yingsu actually turned around and looked at Ren Xiaosu, as if asking for Ren Xiaosu's opinion. At this moment, Li Ran suddenly realized that Ren Xiaosu was probably not an assistant at all, otherwise why would Zhou Yingsu ask for her assistant's opinion? But thinking of this, Li Ran felt that everything made sense. Even Zhou Yingsu couldn't stop Ren Xiaosu from acting alone on the road. If he was just a small assistant, how could he act so recklessly? As he was talking, Muanj came out of the hotel elevator. He ran out after hearing the noise outside in the room. He wanted to join the main force to see what to do. Seeing the stalemate in the lobby, Muanj asked what was going on. As a result, a staff member of the crew told him that this barrier might face attacks from unknown creatures, and they were very powerful. Now Li Ran wanted to ask Zhou Yingsu and Ren Xiaosu for protection, but the plainclothes soldiers around Li Ran refused. When Muanj heard this, he turned around and ran towards Ren Xiaosu, almost holding Ren Xiaosu's hands. He said sincerely, "I have money, please protect me, my life is to be dedicated to art, not to monsters." Everyone in the lobby was stunned. At this time, Li Ran saw Muanj running straight to Ren Xiaosu instead of Zhou Yingsu, and he was not surprised at all, as if this was reasonable. Otherwise, why did Muanj always want Ren Xiaosu to star in his movie? He even chased him to barrier number 74? That makes sense. There were only 2 crew members following Muanj this time, and most of them were from Li Ran's side, with a total of nearly 30 people. Ren Xiaosu was not interested in saving so many people. What's more, if the experimental subject broke in, everyone in the barrier would be in danger of death, so how could he care about others? So many people gathered together, such a big target, are they afraid that the experimental subject can find it? In fact, Ren Xiaosu had discovered before that the experimental subject was not so rigorous when searching the barrier, so even if the southwest barrier was invaded by the experimental subject, there would be a few survivors. Ren Xiaosu thought that if the experimental subject really broke in, he would use Zhou Yingsu's ability to open a small shelter underground to hide in. The Zhou family could not completely abandon barrier number 74. They could just wait for the Zhou family's troops to drive the experimental subject away and then come out. But, is it really that simple? Chapter 561 Dilemma. There were no staff left in the hotel. Only 1 or 2 people were left to guard the store, and the rest had gone home to look for their families. Just as Li Ran and others were sitting in the hotel lobby at a loss, gunshots suddenly rang out outside the rampart, or more precisely, on the rampart's walls. The plainclothes soldiers of the Wang family were standing at the door of the hotel, discussing how to get some weapons and whether they could contact the Wang family and ask them to negotiate with the Zhou family to return the weapons to them. However, after talking on the satellite phone for a long time, the Wang family only agreed to communicate with the Zhou family, but nothing happened. Ren Xiaosu glanced at the soldiers at the door, then pulled Zhou Yingsu aside and said, "Stay here, I'll go out and take a look." Zhou Yingsu immediately became anxious. She lowered her voice and said, "Master, don't run around. I'm scared." "What's the use of being afraid?" Ren Xiaosu took out 2 pistols and 5 or 6 magazines from the space and handed them to Zhou Yingsu. "This hotel is located in the center of the barrier. If something happens here, it means that the entire barrier is doomed. When the time comes, you can just find a place and use your seeds to open a small shelter and wait for me to save you, understand?" "Then will you save Li Ran?" Zhou Yingsu asked. Ren Xiaosu was stunned for a moment. "What time is it? It's good enough to be alive. Why save others? At most, I won't participate in the Anjing Temple selection, but I can't die." Zhou Yingsu suddenly smiled and was no longer afraid. "Okay, master." She was most worried that Ren Xiaosu would just use her to break into the Anjing Temple and then abandon her. Now it seems that she is more important than the mission of joining the Anjing Temple. Ren Xiaosu felt puzzled. How could this woman's expression change so suddenly? She was quite scared just now, but now she just laughed. He walked outside. Li Ran and Mu Wanj panicked when they saw this scene. Li Ran stood up and asked, "Where are you going?" "I'm going outside to take a look," Ren Xiaosu said. "If you leave, who will protect us?" Mu Wanj said anxiously. "What if you don't come back?" Li Ran was a little confused. Ren Xiaosu pursed his lips at Zhou Yingsu. "She's still here." Everyone looked at Zhou Yingsu and saw her checking the guns. No one knew how Zhou Yingsu brought the guns into the barrier. Ren Xiaosu glanced at the plainclothes soldiers and grinned. "We still have them. They are here to protect you." When the soldiers saw the 2 guns in Zhou Yingsu's hands, their eyes lit up. "We are active soldiers. Since you asked us to protect everyone, then these 2 guns should be used by us. Besides, we use guns better." Ren Xiaosu sneered. "Zhou Yingsu, if someone tries to take our guns after I leave, just shoot him to death." Zhou Yingsu also said calmly, "You use guns better? You can't even keep your own gun, so how can you talk about using guns well?" After that, Ren Xiaosu went out. You have to know that Zhou Yingsu is not a weak woman. She is a contestant who can deceive him without batting an eyelid. If these plainclothes soldiers want to target Zhou Yingsu, they will probably die tonight. Ren Xiaosu walked out of the hotel and headed west. That should be the main battlefield where Zhou's troops faced the experimental subjects. As a result, on the way, he suddenly saw more than a dozen extraordinary people in black clothes, running on the roof at a speed similar to his. When they saw him, they just glanced at him and didn't say much. It was strange. Where did more than a dozen extraordinary people come from? The next moment, Ren Xiaosu saw the sabers on their waists. Isn't this the ceramic knife of the Spark Company? Wait, these dozen people are actually members of the Spark Company? I'm afraid they were lurking in barrier number 74 before the experimental subjects arrived. But since they are from the Spark Company, why didn't they take action when they saw an extraordinary person like him? Ren Xiaosu silently changed direction and followed with his shadow, wanting to see what the Spark Company was going to do. The gunshots on the top of the barrier had stopped, and Ren Xiaosu didn't know what was going on outside. Slowly, the members of the Spark Company and Ren Xiaosu approached the western ramparts, only to see that the members of the Spark Company went directly to the Zhou troops to inform them of their identities and actually climbed the ramparts. Ren Xiaosu watched this scene with a sight glass and saw that the Zhou troops had issued firearms to the members of the Spark Company. It seemed that the members of the Spark Company were going to cooperate with the Zhou troops to defend the city. The Spark Company assisted in defending the city and protecting the residents of the ramparts behind them. It turned out that the people of the Spark Company did not arrest him when they saw him, a superhuman, because they had more important things to do. This was a bit subversive to Ren Xiaosu's cognition. When a common disaster for mankind came, even an organization like the Spark Company became part of the defense force. In fact, Ren Xiaosu also understood that if the Zhou troops were defeated, hundreds of thousands of people in the entire rampart would suffer, but to be honest, he really didn't expect the Spark Company to take the initiative to stand up. At this time, Lao Li and Qin Sheng had already received the firearms distributed by the Zhou troops, but Zhou did not assign them specific tasks. It was just that if the experimental subjects rushed to the wall, then they, the superhumans, would be needed to resist. After all, at that time, it would be difficult to kill the experimental subjects directly with pistols and automatic rifles, and the opponent's mobility was extremely strong, so if one experimental subject climbed up the city wall, it would be a huge threat to the entire defense system, and there might even be more experimental subjects rushing up, causing the entire line to collapse. At that time, we could only rely on the newly built fortifications in the city, but that was only used as a last resort. At that moment, the experimental subject just wanted to launch a charge, but Zhou only killed dozens of experimental subjects with a heavy machine gun, and the opponent retreated back to the forest. When the experimental subject came out of the forest again, everyone on the city wall was stunned, because those experimental subjects were driving hundreds of living humans to the barrier. Those people might be known to Lao Li. They were refugees who fled to the wilderness to avoid the consortium. According to common sense, the experimental subjects should kill anyone they see, but now it is different. The opponent has learned to drive humans. Don't humans have heavy machine guns in their hands? Then kill the same kind first. The eastern ramparts also faced the same dilemma. The experimental subjects were not only driving away the refugees, but also a large number of soldiers wearing Zhou's blue uniforms, who seemed to be captured by the reinforcements of the number 73 rampart. To shoot or not to shoot? Lao Li, Qin Sheng, and the members of the Spark Company did not speak, because they were just assisting in the defense, and it was not their turn to make the decision. The commander of the Zhou's troops stood on the wall, and he quietly watched the crowd that was getting closer and closer to the wall. These people were crying and shouting, and their voices were hoarse. There were children held in the arms of adults, with tears all over their faces. Among these refugees were scattered experimental subjects who were responsible for driving them away. 5 or 6 meters behind them was a large army of experimental subjects. If the army on the wall did not move, then as soon as they approached the wall, it would only take half a minute to break down this seemingly solid barrier. The commander of the Zhou's troops said calmly, "Open fire." Chapter 562, City Defense Battle. In the past, no one in the 3 southwestern consortiums took the experimental subjects seriously. Everyone thought that they were just a group of beasts without intelligence. When they had dealt with the affairs between the consortiums, they would naturally be able to deal with the experimental subjects and make clear arrangements. But when Cheng Yu went south and came back to deal with the experimental subjects, Qing had already discovered that the intelligent body in the experimental subjects was not easy to deal with. Nowadays, humans must regard the experimental subjects as beings with the same IQ as themselves and deal with them carefully. For example, now, the Zhou army did not expect that the experimental subjects would actually advance with refugees and prisoners, which made the Zhou army commander on the city wall in a dilemma. Although the Zhou army commander ordered to open fire in a calm tone, you have to know that there are old people and children in the refugee team. After this battle, I am afraid that the Zhou army commander will often be condemned by his conscience. Not everyone can be cold-blooded and ruthless. He just made the most rational and calm judgment based on the current situation. The heavy machine guns on the city wall began to spit out gunfire. In the dark night, the fire in the barrel was like a dragon, like a meteor with a tail. Everyone on the wall of the fortress watched quietly. Lao Li and Qin Sheng saw that the refugees were beaten to a bloody mess. Among them were people they knew. They had just sent medicine some time ago, and the other party gave him a basket of pheasant eggs in return. Lao Li promised them to buy winter cotton jackets for the 12 children, but before the cotton jackets were bought, the 12 children were gone. However, Neither Lao Li nor Qin Sheng stopped the Zhou troops from opening fire, because they knew that this was the most correct choice. Although the knights were upright, they had never been taught to be kind. In the gunfire, the experimental subjects mixed in with the refugees were also pierced by the heavy machine guns. When the experimental subjects found that humans actually opened fire directly, they retreated immediately. They withdrew from the fire coverage of the heavy machine guns as quickly as possible and went into the forest. Some machine gunners were frantically trying to chase them with firepower, but this group of experimental subjects seemed to have been trained. When they fled, they took irregular routes and tried their best to avoid machine gun bullets. The commander of Zhou's troops had already put the experimental subjects as close as possible to prevent them from escaping. However, this time, at most, they would kill a few hundred experimental subjects. In the process of escaping, the experimental subjects also let the defenders on the city wall see the strong physical strength of the opponent. But before the defenders could breathe a sigh of relief, the southern defenders suddenly shouted in the communication channel that the enemy was attacking. What's going on? Did this experimental subject just retreat? Someone was stunned for a moment. No, this is a feint. The commander of Zhou's troops gritted his teeth. Just now, this experimental subject came here with a large number of troops, and even dragged so many refugees with him, making everyone think that they were going to attack the city from this side. Zhou's troops even temporarily transferred a group of troops from the south gate and the north gate, but these reinforcements had just marched halfway on the city wall when they received news that they were asked to return to defend. It turned out that although the Western experimental subject looked powerful, it was just to attract the attention of the defenders. There were other strategies behind it, and each one was more vicious than the other. The commander of Zhou's troops issued an order in the communication channel, "Guard the south for me, and never let the experimental subject climb the city wall." Just 5 minutes ago, everyone had seen the physical strength of the experimental subject. If such a monster climbed the city wall, it would only take 10 minutes in close combat for the entire defense system of the southern city wall to be destroyed. While speaking, the commander of Zhou's troops had seen Lao Li and Qin Sheng rushing towards the south quickly, and even the 15 members of the Spark Company followed closely behind. Both sides were very decisive. Once there was a danger of the southern city wall being seized by the experimental subject, then the south would be the place where they were most needed. When the experimental subject climbed the city wall, only they could drive the experimental subject back down. Ren Xiaosu was watching silently with a spyglass in the distance from a commanding height, but he didn't know what was happening. He could only see a few blurry black dots on the wall, running quickly to the south. Could it be that another experimental subject appeared in the south? However, Ren Xiaosu still did not move. He was still wondering whether he should participate in this defensive battle. In this frantic run, the strength comparison between the knights and the fire seed was immediately apparent. The two knights were running wildly in front, not even breathing hard, and they were pulling the distance between themselves and the fire seed further and further. The members of the fire seed company in the back were running desperately to catch up with Lao Li and Qin Sheng, but they could not do it at all. A commander of the fire seed company suddenly said, "Don't chase their speed, or we will run ourselves down. Save your energy for the close combat later, and don't let the experimental subject climb the wall. The southern defenders should be able to hold on for a while, and it will take time for the knights to rush from the west to the south, at least 20 minutes. Lao Li and Qin Sheng could only pray that the Zhou's defenders in the south were tough enough and would not be defeated all at once. At this time, Ren Xiaosu was also rushing to the south. He thought that if Lao Li and Qin Sheng couldn't hold on, he could at least help if he was closer. Ren Xiaosu thought that even the members of the Spark Company, who he had always hated, stood up at this time. If he still hid and stood by, wouldn't it mean that he was not as good as the people he hated? At this moment, it seemed that everyone was running wildly. The Zhou troops who were coming back to help were also running wildly on the city wall, but as they ran, Lao Li and Qin Sheng slowly surpassed them. Ren Xiaosu was also jumping between the rooftops, but before he could run there, the knight had already reached the southern city wall. At the moment when Lao Li and Qin Sheng arrived, the experimental subject had just climbed up the wall, and his legs stared hard at the edge of the wall. The whole gray body flew towards the heavy machine gun on the wall. This seemed to be what they were most afraid of at the moment. The first batch of experimental subjects who climbed onto the wall were tasked with destroying all heavy firepower. But before they could pounce, Lao Li, like an off-road vehicle, directly knocked down a test subject that was still in the air. Ren Xiaosu immediately found a commanding height and watched through the sight glass. He saw Lao Li opening and closing his fists. Every time he punched, there would be a brilliant star-like brilliance. Lao Li was 5 or 6 meters away from the other test subjects, but he could use this star-like ability to hit the test subjects through the air. Not only Lao Li, but even Qin Sheng had the same fighting style. The starlight was a hit. Ren Xiaosu was stunned by the clear scene in the sight glass. What the hell was this? Are Lao Li and Qin Sheng so fierce? No wonder they dared to wander around in the wilderness. Chapter 563, One Ring After Another. Lao Li and Qin Sheng cooperated very well. Their fighting style seemed to be Lao Li's main attack, while Qin Sheng supported them from the side. The dozens of experimental subjects who climbed the wall could not get close to them for a while. As long as an experimental subject tried to get close to Lao Li, he would be immediately punched out by Qin Sheng, or even knocked off the wall. Ren Xiaosu saw in the target mirror that the boy named Qin Sheng did not seem to be used to his ability, so he was not as confident as Lao Li in the battle, but even so, Qin Sheng could break the bones of the experimental subject with one punch. While Lao Li and Qin Sheng were fighting, members of the Spark Company also arrived. These people immediately formed a new line of defense beside Lao Li and Qin Sheng to intercept the new experimental subjects who climbed the wall. These members of the Spark Company were willing to become Lao Li's flank, and all battles were centered on Lao Li. The members of the Spark Company have always won in quantity, not quality. Of course, this does not include the higher-level combat sequence of the Spark Company. At least for the early morning and dusk sequences, they knew their own strengths and weaknesses, so they always fought in groups of 5. For example, facing a night-level extraordinary person like Lao Li, if they wanted to fight head-on, the dusk team would have to send out at least 15 people. Of course, this was just an assumption. The relationship between Spark and the Night was still very good, and the two sides had no chance to fight. Mass production of extraordinary people was the advantage of Spark Company. These 17 people were like a sharp arrow on the city wall, and Lao Li was the arrowhead of that sharp arrow. Wherever he went to support, the people behind him would follow him. Only if they kept clearing the experimental subjects who climbed onto the city wall, could the Zhou troops continue to use heavy firepower to intercept the experimental subjects that kept emerging from the woods in the distance. Lao Li also thought very clearly that their role was close combat on the city wall. As for large-scale killing of experimental subjects, they still had to rely on thermal weapons, so they had to protect this position well. The Zhou troops were the real main force to defend the city. At this time, the Zhou troops who came back to support had just arrived. They didn't even look at the battle on Lao Li's side, and directly set up a new firepower point not far away. A soldier said in fear, "Sir, there are experimental subjects on the city wall. What are you afraid of?" The battalion commander of this Zhou's army said coldly, "The people who come to help defend the city are not afraid yet. What are you afraid of? Do your own job well, and there are relatives and friends behind you. What you should do now is to pull the trigger and stop those experimental subjects from me, instead of being afraid here." His soldiers gritted their teeth and pulled the trigger fiercely as soon as they set up the heavy machine gun, as if they could not see the terrifying experimental subject roaring only a few dozen meters away from them. In this battle to defend the city, whether it was the Zhou's army, or the Spark, or the Night, they all performed their duties and tried their best to do what they should do. They were not children anymore, so they must understand that only by doing their own things well can the city be defended. Ren Xiaosu looked at this scene and was shocked in his heart. He had seen wars and participated in wars in the Northwest, and even fought against the entire barrier alone. But those were all wars between humans. Now when humans face foreign enemies, different organizations and forces have abandoned their own interests and positions. This is a completely different feeling. The 15 members of the Spark Company should be lurking in the number 74 rampart. Their original purpose may be to capture the extraordinary, but now they have put everything aside to resist the foreign enemy. Seeing that the experimental subjects on the southern rampart wall were gradually suppressed, and even some experimental subjects took the initiative to jump off the wall, this might be a signal that the experimental subjects were ready to retreat. Ren Xiaosu turned around and left silently. It seemed that he didn't need to take action this time. The skills of Lao Li and Qin Sheng were comparable to his own shadow. With these two people, it would not be so easy for the experimental subjects to climb the wall again for a while. But the experimental subject siege seemed to be still not over at this time. Suddenly, the southwest rampart suddenly became chaotic. The soldiers in charge of logistics there began to wail, and residents escaped from their houses and ran towards the rampart from there as if there was something extremely terrifying behind them. Ren Xiaosu suddenly looked up at the city wall. The battle was still going on over there. Zhou's troops seemed to have not yet reacted. A new experimental subject had sneaked into the barrier. But there was no loophole on the city wall. How did this experimental subject get into the barrier? Ren Xiaosu picked up the sight glass again and saw a hole more than 1 meter wide in the southwest. An experimental subject was crawling out of it. The source of fear for the logistics troops and residents was these suddenly appeared experimental subjects. It was not until this moment that Ren Xiaosu was shocked. It turned out that no matter how powerful the previous experimental subject's attack was, it was just a cover for this experimental subject. Those experimental subjects didn't know how long they had been preparing. They actually dug a tunnel in the wilderness outside that could enter the barrier. What Ren Xiaosu didn't know was that the experimental subjects had actually left the Qing's territory long ago and had arrived in the Central Plains long ago. However, both Lali and Zhou's troops thought they had just arrived. And these experimental subjects made so many preparations just for this tunnel. When the tunnel began to approach the rampart, the large force of the experimental subjects began to attack the city, not for anything else, just to attract the attention of the frontal troops, and also to use the sound of human gunfire to cover the sound of digging the tunnel. It was not until this moment that the tunnel was dug through that the real purpose was revealed. Ren Xiaosu felt a chill on his back. He was also a person who had faced experimental subjects, but was the wisdom of this experimental subject able to link one strategy after another in a day's battle? Will there be a day when the experimental subject uses human artillery to attack the human city? Ren Xiaosu looked at the tunnel. Because the tunnel was not wide, the number of experimental subjects that came out was not large. But if they were allowed to destroy the defense system of the rampart from the inside, or climb up the wall from behind the defense position and knock down the heavy machine guns, it would be troublesome. Ren Xiaosu put away the target telescope and went upstream in the fleeing crowd. Since even the Spark Company stood up, there was no reason for him to continue to retreat. They were just some experimental subjects. In the crowd, a shadow wearing a white mask rushed towards the experimental subjects. When one experimental subject saw the shadow, he pounced on it, but the shadow grabbed his gray, hard and rough face with his hands and slammed him to the ground. The shadow half knelt on the ground and released his palm. The experimental subject under his hand was no longer moving. The brain of the experimental subject had been smashed into paste, and even the stone road on the ground was cracked. The other experimental subjects who were chasing humans slowly stopped and surrounded the shadow. Chapter 564 Every man has his own responsibility. This time, Shadow was the main force in the frontal battle. More than 10 experimental subjects surrounded Shadow, but they were not in a hurry to attack. Among the experimental subjects, the leader made mixed and hoarse roars, as if communicating with his companions on how to deal with a human in front of him. The other party had already deviated from the normal language of humans, and instead was more like the way of communication of animals. But the experimental subject did not move, but Shadow did. Seeing that more and more experimental subjects were coming out of the cave behind, if they were not killed, there would be more and more experimental subjects on the ground. These more than 10 experimental subjects were clearly just delaying time for their companions behind. Shadow jumped up and actually flew directly over the head of an experimental subject and flew towards the direction of the cave. Seeing that the experimental subject could not hold back Shadow, he stood up and tried to entangle with Shadow in the air with his teeth and claws, but what he did not expect was that Shadow seemed to have expected it to move and chopped it on the head with a knife. The black knife mixed with a whistling wind, and there was a buzzing sound. Before the experimental subject touched Shadow's body, it was cut in half by a knife. The Shadow didn't stop, and rushed out of the cave as soon as it landed. The experimental subjects behind him, who were originally fighting towards the center of the barrier, all followed the Shadow at once. They had to guard the entrance of the cave for the experimental subject troops behind them so that other experimental subjects could pass through the tunnel safely. This seemed to be a death order given to them by the intelligent body among them. 5 or 6 experimental subjects rose from the ground and pounced from behind the Shadow. The other party looked human, but the crawling movements and gray skin color made them look like huge spiders, which was extremely weird. Just when the experimental subject behind him was about to pounce on the Shadow from the top of his head, the Shadow suddenly bent down and slid along the ground to barely avoid the pursuit behind him. One experimental subject was about to get out of the cave, but saw a figure sliding from the ground and chop off its head with a knife. The body of the experimental subject fell back into the cave weakly, pressing down the companion who was also about to get out of the ground. The test subject below roared, and pushed the body of its companion aside. Just as it was about to get out of the tunnel, it was pierced through the head by a sudden black knife above its head. In just a short moment, 4 test subjects in the tunnel were killed by the black knife. The black knife was so sharp that even the test subjects that could not be penetrated by bullets could not resist it. The bodies of these 4 test subjects blocked the exit of the cave, and Shadow stood on their bodies, listening to the unwilling roars of the remaining test subjects in the cave, but had already turned his attention to the test subjects outside. The test subjects who gathered on the street looked at the cold white mask and the black knife dripping with turbid liquid, and they were a little scared for a while. Killing this human in front of them was like mowing the grass. If this human was outside the barrier, they could easily kill him with numbers, but now there were only 8 or 9 test subjects left in the barrier, and they actually felt that they were the weak ones. In the blink of an eye, this human had blocked their last trump card in this siege. Old Lee and others on the wall saw this scene at the edge of the wall. In a glimpse, Shadow faced so many experimental subjects alone and sealed the tunnel tightly. Qin Sheng looked at the back and suddenly felt that the other party seemed to have the courage to be invincible. Killing experimental subjects is not uncommon, but being able to scare the experimental subjects to stay in place and not dare to move is not something that everyone can do. From beginning to end, Ren Xiaosu did not participate in the battle himself, because Shadow was enough. He was lying on the commanding heights of a building in the distance, and the sniper rifle could spray gunfire at any time. However, Ren Xiaosu did not act rashly. Shadow was enough to deal with these experimental subjects. If he fired casually, the appearance of this sniper might easily make Enjing Temple or Huazong think of Zhou Yingsu. Of course, this possibility is very small. If necessary, Ren Xiaosu would not care whether he would expose anything at this time. Suddenly, Ren Xiaosu saw a young man, who was also rushing towards the battlefield against the crowd. His steps were weak, and he did not look like a superhuman. He probably had not received any physical training, so he began to breathe heavily after running for a while. This way of breathing could easily hurt his lungs. The young man had a camera hanging around his neck, and a dark blue work badge. Ren Xiaosu could not see the words on the badge, but he guessed that he was probably a reporter. At this moment, the residents of the fortress already understood what kind of monster they were facing. Before, they complained that Zhou's army was too aggressive, and even demolished many houses to build fortifications in the city, and even conscripted all adult men. Only a small number of men escaped the conscription, which made the residents of the fortress very dissatisfied. But when they saw with their own eyes how the experimental subjects tore humans apart, they would recognize Zhou's army from the bottom of their hearts. Only when their own interests and life safety were threatened, they could understand the significance of Zhou's army's existence. While the residents were fleeing in panic, some reporters actually rushed towards the battlefield, just to catch the first-hand news. Ren Xiaosu didn't quite understand what these reporters were thinking. The next moment, the experimental subjects in the cave seemed to start evacuating, and the experimental subjects in front of Shadow suddenly fled. They turned away from Shadow. One of the experimental subjects came to a manhole cover and stretched out his gray palm to lift the manhole cover and then drill into the sewer. But when it lifted it, it didn't move. At this time, Ren Xiaosu suddenly admired Zhou's troops. If Zhou's troops hadn't welded the manhole cover in advance, if the experimental subjects escaped into the sewer now, I'm afraid these experimental subjects would become a great destabilizing factor in the future. God knows what they would do when they come out again. If the other party drilled into the sewer and fled separately, even Shadow couldn't catch up. The direction in which the experimental subjects fled was exactly where the young reporter was. There were no residents around the reporter. Everyone had already fled. He stood blankly on the street and stopped walking. The young reporter was stunned when he saw the experimental subjects gathered around a manhole cover. However, out of the reporter's instinct, the hand holding the camera kept pressing the shutter button. Behind the experimental subjects, there was a shadow chasing them. The shadow's white mask was unusually abrupt in the camera lens. The calm expression on the mask seemed to form a sharp contrast with the experimental subjects who were fleeing in panic. Of course, the welded manhole cover could not stop the experimental subjects. They directly smashed the manhole cover with their arms, but just as they got in, A roar came from the sewer. Ren Xiaosu used the shadow gate to drop 10 grenades and blew them out again. However, they were still complete experimental subjects when they went in, but they were broken experimental subjects when they came out. It was not until this time that Zhou's emergency team and the barrier arrived. There will be more updates in the evening, but I am not sure when I can finish writing and how many updates I can make. Friends who go to bed early should not wait, just read it tomorrow morning. Chapter 565. A brief calm. Ren Xiaosu didn't want to have anything to do with Zhou's troops, nor did he want to be entangled by the people of Spark Company. After all, he had controlled Laosu to kill many members of Spark Company during the fall of East Lake, and the hatred was still quite big. So when Zhou's emergency troops arrived, Ren Xiaosu had already left. After 3 attempts at attacking, the experimental subject completely retreated. As the saying goes, 3 times is the limit. After failing to take down barrier number 74 for 3 consecutive times, there was no need for the experimental subject to continue to waste time, but to plan to find an opportunity later. But the experimental subject did not evacuate too far, and seemed to be in the woods outside barrier number 74. No one from Zhou's troops dared to go to the woods to check. To be honest, all the people who participated in the defense of barrier number 74 did not expect that they were just a group of wild beasts in everyone's impression, but they were actually in danger and almost broke the city. If it weren't for the man with a white mask who suddenly appeared and blocked the gap, judging from the support speed of Zhou's emergency troops, barrier number 74 would be in danger now. You know, if the experimental subjects rushed in to cause destruction, it would not only cause panic and chaos among the residents of the city, but the other side would definitely try their best to destroy their defense facilities. However, I am afraid that the experimental subjects did not expect that their 3 interlocking siege plans would fail in the end. After the experimental subjects retreated, barrier number 74 experienced a brief calm. The war lasted from night to early morning. Lao Li, Qin Sheng and others sat tiredly on the city wall, watching the morning sun shining on their faces. A gust of cold wind blew, and Lao Li and Qin Sheng realized that their clothes were soaked with sweat, and it was particularly cold sitting in the wind. At this time, the staff officer of Zhou's army came over to greet them. Dear knights and friends of fire, please take a shower and change your clothes first. After a short rest, please come to the summary meeting. The experimental subjects will definitely come again, and we must summarize the mistakes in this war. Lao Li struggled to stand up. There were still scars on his arms where he was accidentally scratched by the experimental subjects. He smiled and said, "This wound should not make me look like them, right?" The staff officer shook his head. "No, the experimental subjects are injected with drugs to assimilate humans into them." "You seem to know the experimental subjects very well," Qin Sheng asked. "The information shared by Qing," said the staff officer, "was also told in advance by Qing that the experimental subjects might attack barrier number 74. If Qing hadn't informed us, giving us time to mobilize troops in advance, we would really be in trouble this time." "So that's what happened," Old Li muttered. "Qing isn't quite the same as the legend says." The Knight and Spark went to take a hot bath in the barrier. This time, 15 Spark men came to participate in the battle. 4 of them had been killed after a fierce battle, but they didn't seem sad at all, as if they were not very familiar with their teammates. After everyone sat down in the conference room, the commander of the Spark Company at barrier number 74 said bluntly, "Who is the man with the white mask? Is he from your Zhou family? He appeared in your Zhou family's barrier twice. We thought he was from Anjing Temple before, but now it seems that he has a closer relationship with your Zhou family." Zhou Xingwen, the commander of the Zhou family's troops, said calmly, "He has nothing to do with my Zhou family. He must have appeared in barrier number 74 by chance. Now let's talk about the upcoming battle to defend the city. First of all, thank you all for your great help. Without you, barrier number 74 could not be defended." The commander of the Spark Company said calmly, "Don't thank us. We all have the responsibility to fight against a common external enemy of mankind. Our Spark Company's personnel at barrier number 73 will also come with the next batch of Zhou family reinforcements." Old Li suddenly said, "But the emergency forces in your Zhou's fortress should be more vigilant and move faster. If the test subjects can dig 1 tunnel, they can dig 10 more. You have all seen how strong the physical fitness of those monsters is. It only takes 2 or 3 days to dig a tunnel." Zhou Xingwen nodded. This time it was our emergency forces that failed to do their job, and we also underestimated the test subjects. After a brief discussion, the main content of the meeting was actually to optimize the current defense plan. Old Lee and others prepared to go to the Zhou's troops base to rest first. After all, they were also very tired. At this time, Hua's Hong Company brought up the old matter again. I suggest that Zhou Company should find the man with the white mask. Hua's Hong Company promises to temporarily put aside hatred and fight the enemy together with him. With such a person, if there is a test subject breaking into the city, we will be much more relaxed. Zhou Xingwen sighed and shook his head. It's not easy to find. Old Lee didn't care. Don't worry, since Lee stood up this time, he will definitely stand up next time. When Ren Xiaosu returned to the hotel, a group of people were lying on the sofa in the hotel lobby. Zhou Yingsu was very sober and kept on guard with a gun. The 10 plainclothes soldiers from Wang's company were also awake. They found knives and iron rods from the hotel to protect themselves. Ren Xiaosu thought that these people were not useless, but they were just a little stereotyped. To be honest, Ren Xiaosu suspected that these soldiers might not have been on the battlefield. After all, there were no wars in the Central Plains in recent years, so it was normal for these soldiers not to have seen blood. And no consortium would really send elite soldiers to protect a female star. A plainclothes officer frowned at Ren Xiaosu's return and asked, "We fought outside all night, and you disappeared all night. What were you doing?" Ren Xiaosu glanced at him and said, "I went to help defend the city." "What does it have to do with you? There is no trace of fighting on you. You said you went to defend the city." The plainclothes officer sneered. As a result, Ren Xiaosu did not intend to answer his question at all, but walked to Zhou Yingsu's side and said, "Did anything unexpected happen at night?" "No, they were all very honest." Zhou Yingsu shook her head. "Did the experimental subjects really attack us?" "Yes," Ren Xiaosu nodded. "I saw it with my own eyes, and the IQ of the experimental subjects should not be underestimated now. Their numbers are also growing. If they could have been annihilated at the 113th barrier, these things would not have happened. The entire Southwest was in chaos at that time. Who had the time to take care of them?" Zhou Yingsu sighed. "Okay, go back to your room and rest. I don't think the experimental subjects will attack again in the short term," Ren Xiaosu said. Zhou Yingsu said, "You should go and have a rest. I just sat all night and I'm not tired." "But you must have fought the experiment head-on." A plainclothes officer next to them glanced at the two of them, but didn't say anything else. He just sneered. It was really because what Ren Xiaosu said to them before was too harsh, so it was hard for them to have any good impression of Ren Xiaosu. Chapter 566 Chaos begins. Ren Xiaosu thought for a moment and said to Zhou Yingsu, "Then I'll go upstairs and sleep for a few hours. You can call me at noon." "Okay," Zhou Yingsu nodded. But before Ren Xiaosu went upstairs, he suddenly saw someone riding a green bicycle passing by on the road. There were 2 green cloth bags hanging behind the bicycle, and the words Hope Media were written on the cloth bags. Ren Xiaosu ran outside and said, "Is it today's newspaper? Give me one. Why don't you take a break at this time? You don't look like a newspaper delivery man." The other person was wearing a suit, which is not what ordinary newspaper delivery workers wear. The newspaper deliveryman smiled and said, "We are the staff of Hope Media. The newspaper deliverymen have all gone home. There is no other way, so I can only deliver it myself." As he said that, the other person handed Ren Xiaosu a newspaper. "Today's newspapers in barrier number 74 are free of charge." Ren Xiaosu was stunned for a moment and said, "Thank you." The plainclothes officer next to him saw Ren Xiaosu taking the newspaper and took one himself. Usually, Feng Zhile would do this kind of thing. He would buy new newspapers wherever he passed by. Ren Xiaosu spread out the newspaper. Today's newspaper was a bit strange. 4 pages were devoted to the experiment subject's attack on barrier number 74. The first page focused on the fact that Wang's spokesperson announced to the media that they could send troops to support Zhou at any time to help Zhou defeat the enemy and strangle the experiment subject in the south of the Central Plains. However, Zhou rejected Wang's proposal and told the media that Wang should not take advantage of the situation at this critical moment. This was the common enemy of mankind. If they really wanted to help, there was no need to send troops. Zhou's army was enough. You just needed to transport some supplies. Ren Xiaosu was amused. The 2 consortiums actually tore each other apart in the newspaper. It seemed that Zhou thought that Wang's sending troops was not well-intentioned. After all, no one would allow other people's troops to walk around in their territory. Who knows what the other party was up to? The second page of the newspaper was more informative. The media actually talked about the course of the war in detail, but it was mainly observed from the perspective of reporters, and interviewed Zhou's senior management afterwards as a supplement. It even focused on the strategies of the experimental subjects, which shocked all those who thought that the experimental subjects were just a group of wild beasts. High-dimensional civilizations have always looked down on low-dimensional civilizations. In the eyes of many consortiums, the experimental subjects are just savage beasts that can only vanish in front of hot weapons. Now, the experimental subjects may refresh their cognition. In the third edition, the 3 reporters of Hope Media stationed at Fortress No. 74 actually used their cameras to capture many moments of the battle, such as the knights and the sparks driving and killing the experimental subjects on the city wall. Those scenes that even Ren Xiaosu could not see clearly were captured by the reporters with extremely expensive lenses. Among them, Hope Media gave great affirmation to the Spark Company, praising the other party's behavior of putting down their positions to fight the enemy together, and stated that new members of the Spark Company have joined the reinforcement force in Fortress No. 73. In everyone's impression, this is probably the first time that Hope Media has praised the Spark Company. Although the relationship between Spark and King was good in the past, Hope Media has always been critical of the actions of the Spark Company. When it came to the 4th page, Ren Xiaosu suddenly realized that the most eye-catching photo on this page was Lao Su. In the photo, Lao Su was wearing a white mask, and the experimental subjects were fleeing in panic. This scene was a bit shocking because the photo captured all the details so clearly. The reporter of Hope Media actually took many photos, but in the one he chose, Lao Su's figure was a bit blurry. Only the tall figure and the abrupt and conspicuous white mask could be seen clearly. The clearest thing in the photo was the expression of the experimental subject. It was no longer a ferocious expression, but fear. The title of this page was even, "The Age of Gods." This newspaper directly raised the status of the extraordinary to another level, and even the terrifying experimental subjects became the foil of the extraordinary. Of course, this was actually a lot of beautification. After all, everyone who participated in the war understood that the most terrifying thing about the experimental subjects was their number, a number that even the Spark Company could not match, and their cruelty. Ren Xiaosu was reading the newspaper, while Zhou Yingxu was watching beside him. While reading, she kept glancing at Ren Xiaosu. She whispered, "Master, is this you?" Ren Xiaosu was surprised and whispered, "How did you guess it? Is it so obvious? Did you tell from his figure or something else?" "That's not the case. You deliberately wore baggy clothes so I couldn't tell from his figure. But I didn't see you on the whole page of the newspaper. I thought this person might be you. After all, only you are so tough that you can chase after the experimental subject," Zhou Yingxu muttered. Ren Xiaosu is speechless. Zhou Yingxu actually used the method of elimination to infer. Because she didn't see him in the newspaper, she thought he was the most powerful one? Anyway, regardless of whether the person wearing the white mask is Ren Xiaosu or not, the flattery has been done. However, while the two were talking in a low voice, a plain-clothed officer beside them laughed and said, "Didn't you say you were going to the war? Why didn't I see you in the newspaper? Didn't you hide?" Ren Xiaosu glanced at him and ignored him, so as to avoid him getting more excited. Among the people present, even Mu Wanj didn't know that the person wearing the white mask was him. After all, it was Ren Xiaosu who saved Mu Wanj. So, since you have hidden your identity, don't expose it casually, so as to avoid the anger of the Spark Company after the war. Ren Xiaosu continued to read the newspaper. The entertainment section even mentioned Li Ran, but the topic was also related to the No. 74 barrier war. It was about the cancellation of the concert for some reason. At this moment, the sound of smashing glass was heard on the street outside the hotel. The noise woke up Li Ran and the others. Li Ran, wrapped in a blanket, opened his hazy eyes and asked, "What's wrong?" Ren Xiaosu walked out and saw that a group of people were smashing the windows of grocery stores and grain and oil stores on the road. After the windows were smashed, a large group of people rushed in, trying to find food. Once the first person did this, more people would immediately join the ranks of robbery. This kind of thing was like a contagious virus, but it was particularly despicable. The after effects of Zhou's grain confiscation are here. Ren Xiaosu sighed. Fortress No. 74 has been blocked for several days, and the grain and oil store has been emptied by Zhou's troops. Now many residents can't eat, and hungry people can do anything. 2 more chapters to make up for the past 2 months, and ask for the last monthly ticket. There is also a guaranteed monthly ticket for November in a few hours. Thank you everyone, I'm cured now. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 567 Chaos in the War. When Ren Xiaosu saw that some residents of the fortress were making trouble, he immediately closed the door of the hotel. There were already a lot of things going on in the fortress, and he was thinking about how to deal with it after returning to the room. As a result, it was so chaotic that he had no time to think about what to do in the future. However, after this group of rioters broke into the grain and oil store, they found that the grain in the grain and oil store had long been emptied by Zhou's troops. Some people even wanted to break into the grain warehouse, but there were heavy guards of Zhou's troops there, so they didn't dare to go there to make trouble. Then, these rioters began to loot the restaurants in the fortress, because restaurants usually cook a lot of food, and they must have rice, flour, seasonings, and cooking oil stored. Some restaurants were locked, and the bosses were hiding inside and were glad that they still had surplus food. The doors of the restaurants were smashed open by the rioters, and everything in the store was looted. Zhou's emergency forces began to intervene. After arresting a group of rioters, the rioters only stayed quiet for an afternoon before they started to make trouble again, and it became more and more chaotic. They found that Zhou's emergency troops were not as many as they had imagined, and there were rumors that being in prison would not have any impact, and they would be released after the war, and they would have food in prison. This time, the 74th barrier was even more chaotic. The 74th barrier had never encountered such a thing before, and the handling of public opinion was not so timely, so that the rumors were spread all over the city. Zhou came out to say that it was false, and said that they did not have much food, and they had to give priority to Zhou's troops. After all, they had to defend the city and fight, and they could not starve. But at this time, the rioters did not believe it. They even argued, why should they give priority to the troops? We are all human beings and enjoy the same rights. Among these rioters, most people just followed the crowd, but a few people jumped the most happily and took the initiative to lead others to make trouble. If it was wartime, these people would definitely not dare to make such a fuss, but now the newspapers said that the experimental subjects were repelled in 3 sieges, and those experimental subjects could not get in at all. Gradually, these people were no longer satisfied with just having enough food. The next morning, a gold shop was smashed. Some people, having tasted the sweetness, went to ram the bank, but there were troops stationed in the bank, and they fired warning shots, which scared the rioters away. Later, some women came out to make trouble, demanding that the men in their families be released, and for this, they even pulled banners. These women had legitimate reasons for making trouble. Their men were conscripted away, and some male rioters who had escaped the conscription harassed women every now and then, so they had to let their men come back to protect them. Zhou Xingwen, the commander of the Zhou army, had been frowning for the past 2 days. He still had to think about how to deal with the next siege of the experimental subject, but now he was disturbed by this troublesome matter in the fortress. A staff officer nearby said, "Why don't we release those recruited adult males first?" "No," Zhou Xingwen frowned, "if we release these people, the barrier will only become more chaotic. Just lock them up on the construction side and release them after the test subjects are beaten. Let the emergency forces suppress the chaos outside by force. But there are still many reporters in the barrier. Then drive them away." Within 2 days, the chaos in Zhou's barrier calmed down a little, but that was only on the surface. There were still groups of rioters robbing at night. The food they robbed from the hotel had been eaten up, and these people were planning to move the hotel again. Li Ran and others were discussing countermeasures in the hotel lobby when a group of rioters smashed the door of the hotel. When the rioters rushed into the lobby, they were stunned because they knew Li Ran. To be honest, the rioters didn't expect to meet a big star like Li Ran here. Everyone restrained themselves a lot at once, and some even asked Li Ran for an autograph. Li Ran glanced at Zhou Yingsu next to her in a smug manner. However, when she signed autographs for the mob, one of the middle-aged men actually reached out to hug her. Li Ran pushed him away angrily. "What are you doing?" The mob said, "I really like listening to your songs, just hugging." As he said that, the middle-aged man took advantage of the chaos to hug her again. Li Ran slapped him in the face with his backhand. At this time, someone in the mob suddenly shouted, "What's wrong with being a star? Can stars be so high and mighty as to slap people? Today we just want to hug, let's see who can stop us." Li Ran was stunned. Originally, the scene was fine, just like a fan meeting, but in the blink of an eye, it was instigated and turned into a riot. The mob crowded towards her. Zhou Yingsu looked at Ren Xiaosu, but Ren Xiaosu looked up at the ceiling. The plainclothes officers responsible for protecting Li Ran rushed out at once, and greeted the mob in the front with iron bars in their hands. These rioters are bullies who only bully the weak and fear the strong. Seeing the plainclothes officers beating people fiercely, they immediately retreated with their heads in their hands. Ren Xiaosu watched from the side and thought that these plainclothes officers were quite useful at this time. The 10 people cooperated with each other and fought in an orderly manner. Some of them were in the front and some were covering on the flanks. After all, they were people who had received formal military training, so they would not be unable to deal with even a few rioters. But during the scuffle, a gunshot stunned everyone. The plainclothes officers who were using iron rods to drive away the rioters also froze in place. They were soldiers, so they knew the power of guns better. If they were shot at this time, they would not even have time to rescue them. A rioter raised a gun with a bruised face and nose. "Let's see who dares to touch me." The hotel lobby was silent, and even the rioters who came with him were frightened. He only heard the rioter shouting, "That female star, come here, follow me, I will let you go when I am happy." Just when he said this, a figure suddenly flashed by, and the gun in the rioter's hand disappeared. Ren Xiaosu threw the rioter's gun to a plainclothes soldier. "You continue." After saying that, Ren Xiaosu went upstairs to read a book, as if he had done something insignificant. The rioters looked at the black muzzle of the plainclothes pointing at them, and immediately dispersed. But something even more surprising happened. The rioters left, and many women heard from somewhere that Li Ran had food and could protect women. So many women came to Li Ran to seek shelter. Li Ran did not make the decision on her own. She went to Ren Xiaosu's room to ask if she could take in these women. Ren Xiaosu just glanced at her and told her to make the decision. If they wanted to be sheltered, she would do it herself. Ren Xiaosu and Zhou Yingsu were only responsible for protecting Li Ran's safety. Chapter 568, Reinforcements Attacked. Although Ren Xiaosu told Li Ran to make the decision, Li Ran could see that Ren Xiaosu obviously didn't want to cause trouble, so he simply hid in the hotel and asked Feng Zhi to coax away all the women who came to seek refuge. In addition, a famous company in the number 74 barrier suddenly started distributing porridge. The residents of the barrier could use their ID cards to swipe to get porridge, 2 servings per person per day. There were 41 porridge stalls in the entire barrier, and for a while, all the residents of the barrier were in a mess with pots and pans to get porridge. Ren Xiaosu took a look and found that the porridge in the porridge stall was not too thin, at least it would not be a problem for the residents of the barrier to survive. The other party held a black instrument in his hand, and swiped the resident's ID card. If the green light was on, the porridge would be distributed, and if the red light was on, it meant that the other party had already taken the porridge, and the other party would not distribute it again. Many residents of the barrier tried to get more, but no one succeeded. Ren Xiaosu thought that the Zhou Consortium must be behind this company. After all, the food for the entire fortress was in the hands of the Zhou Consortium. But why didn't Zhou do this kind of good thing in their own name? Instead, they let this company do it for them. And Ren Xiaosu saw those people who distributed porridge. Each of them was big and strong, and some of them had tattoos on their necks, looking like gang members. Because the residents of the fortress could eat, the chaos did not last too long, and there was a news report in the new newspaper of Hope Media that the Zhou troops of Fortress number 73 had regrouped and had set out to Fortress number 74 to encircle and suppress the experimental subjects, with a number of up to 14,000 people. Many rioters felt that the war might be over soon, and making trouble again would be tantamount to seeking death. These people just dared to make trouble when Zhou had no time to take care of them, and when Zhou had time to deal with them, it would be no more difficult than stepping on an ant. At a normal marching speed, it would take about 3 days for the reinforcements to reach the outside of barrier number 74, But because the matter was too urgent, it would probably take 2 days to arrive if they marched at full speed. Li Ran and others cheered in the lobby, and even Ren Xiaosu smiled. It seemed that barrier number 74 could be relieved this time, and the experimental subjects could only retreat back to the mountain again. But on the afternoon of the next day, the second division of the reinforcements from barrier number 73 was on the way to barrier number 74. When they were about to pass a mountain road, a dense crowd of experimental subjects suddenly rushed down from the woods on the mountain. The mountain road was narrow, and the experimental subjects rushed over from a high position. It was difficult for the tanks of the second division to have any impact on them. There was a mountain on the left and a cliff on the right. The experimental subjects had chosen this location for a long time. However, the second division was well prepared for this. They expected that the experimental subjects would sneak attack the reinforcements halfway like last time, so the armored vehicles loaded with heavy machine guns were always on guard to prevent the experimental subjects from attacking the troop formation. The soldiers on the armored vehicle immediately adjusted the angle of the heavy machine gun to bring all the test subjects into the shooting angle. Moreover, this time, even the infantry's automatic rifles were equipped with grenade launchers, and many ammunition simply used white phosphorus bombs. White phosphorus bombs are a type of grenade, artillery shell, and bomb. The basic structure is to fill the shell with phosphorus powder, which will start to self-ignite when it encounters air until it is consumed. Ordinary bullets can't penetrate the test subjects, so let's use white phosphorus bombs to burn them. It seems that this is the first time that the test subjects have encountered such individual combat weapons that can effectively kill them, so that the first batch of test subjects who rushed up were directly burned to death, and the entire forest began to catch fire, so that the originally green mountains were ablaze. Just when the chief officer of the second division thought he had won, hundreds of test subjects suddenly climbed up from the bottom of the mountain and attacked again from the side. This time, when Zhou's troops used the killing weapon of white phosphorus bombs, they found that they used them in the wrong place. After the test subjects that had rushed to the nearby area were hit by the white phosphorus bombs, the white phosphorus bombs did not instantly burn the test subjects to ashes. Instead, the ignited flames were brought into the crowd by the test subjects, causing greater casualties to Zhou's troops. In close combat, white phosphorus bombs are a double-edged sword. Although they can kill the enemy, they can also hurt themselves. The vitality of the test subjects is much stronger than that of ordinary soldiers, so that before the test subjects died, Zhou's own soldiers could not bear it first. Moreover, some soldiers were surprised to find that among this group of test subjects, there were more than 10 test subjects that were very different from the others. Other test subjects moved by crawling, but these 10 test subjects always walked upright. In just a moment, these 10 or so experimental bodies rushed into the formation of the second division. A soldier hit one of the experimental bodies with a white phosphorus bomb, but the other party was unmoved with flames and white smoke on its body. It rushed to an armored vehicle, grabbed the wheel of an armored vehicle with its bare hands, and flipped it directly to the bottom of the cliff on the right. The heavy body of the armored vehicle rolled continuously on the hillside, and the solid body was also broken. The soldiers who saw this scene were all scared. They didn't expect that there was such a fierce existence in this experimental body. How much strength does it take to flip over an armored vehicle with bare hands? Exclamation mark. These 10 or so experimental bodies shuttled through Zhou's troops. They didn't want to fight. When they met ordinary infantry, they would use their bodies to break the bones and tendons of the opponent. When they met an armored vehicle, they would flip it directly to the bottom of the cliff. These experimental bodies are like the strongest warriors in the entire tribe. They are completely aiming to destroy Zhou's heavy firepower. They are fearless and of infinite strength. They were like a sharp knife that stabbed Zhou's troops in the heart, and even twisted it twice. During the test subject's advance, Zhou's soldiers tried to shoot with guns and cannons, but the test subject was too fast. The opponent shuttled freely in Zhou's troops, and hitting ordinary soldiers was like hitting a child. This was the result of the crushing of strength and speed. Although the number of these upright test subjects was small, their destructive effect on the battlefield was too great. Until a minute later, when a test subject was about to smash a soldier as before, the soldier suddenly took the initiative to pounce on it. At the moment the two sides collided, the explosives in the soldier's arms immediately detonated, and the soldier and the test subject were blown to pieces. The huge airwave lifted up the surrounding soldiers, and even the armored vehicles not far away were shaking. When they were close, There were even soldiers killed by the aftermath. In this ambush, it seemed that Zhou's soldiers could only use this method to effectively stop the footsteps of the test subject. More and more soldiers started to commit suicide and die together. During this period, the experimental subjects learned to be smart. They avoided humans and only destroyed armored vehicles and tanks, and did not collide with soldiers head-on. As a result, some soldiers died in vain. Although the explosives exploded, the experimental subjects avoided the explosion. Chapter 569, Isolated and Helpless. Since the test subjects began to hide from those soldiers, the rate of casualties of the test subjects began to drop sharply, and the mobile forces in the 2nd Division began to suffer heavy losses. But what surprised the test subjects was that some humans with physical fitness, second only to theirs, also started such suicide attacks. The members of the Spark Company carried explosives and searched for the traces of the test subjects on the battlefield. As soon as they saw the test subjects, they immediately rushed up and died together. It was because of the participation of the Spark Company that the chaos was reversed. The number of members of the Spark Company joining the reinforcements this time was 30, that is, 6 teams, 3 early morning teams, and 3 dusk teams. Their physical fitness was not as strong as these upright test subjects, but it was enough to launch a suicide attack on the test subjects, exchanging their lives for lives. Before this, the soldiers in Zhou's army didn't even like these members of the Spark Company, because everyone always felt that they were too gloomy and didn't like to communicate with Zhou's soldiers. But at this moment, everyone admired them from the bottom of their hearts. It was obviously the Spark Company with a bad reputation, and now it stood up to fight side by side with them. In the past, we always heard that some extraordinary person was very powerful in the Central Plains, but now we haven't seen those people. Soon, only 2 of the 10 upright experimental subjects were left after being blown up, and the experimental subjects rushing down the mountain would find it difficult to break through the machine gun position of the 2nd Division without the assistance of these upright experimental subjects. At the moment when all the soldiers and generals of the 2nd Division were filled with hope, someone suddenly shouted, "More than 10 of those upright experimental subjects have climbed up from the mountain." But when they spoke, it was too late. Suddenly, I saw an experimental subject carrying a bag of strange things and quickly got into Zhou's troops. Then there was a loud bang, and dust and flesh flew all over the sky. The commander of the 2nd Division, who was watching this scene from afar, was dumbfounded. This time, the experimental subject launched a suicide attack on them. This experimental subject started to use thermal weapons. The commander of the 2nd Division said with a heavy face, "Evacuate, evacuate in an orderly manner." Every time at this time, it is difficult to make any decision. If some people have to evacuate, some people are destined to stay here forever, and even be assimilated into new experimental subjects. The result is that after a battle, the number of experimental subjects does not seem to have decreased much, and the soldiers have strong physical fitness. After being assimilated into experimental subjects, they may become the kind of experimental subjects who walk upright and have infinite strength. Of course, these experimental subjects seem to be selective in assimilating humans. Qing once calculated the ratio, and it seems that the experimental subjects choose the assimilation ratio when choosing 7%. Now that they are retreating, they should be able to retain 2/3 of their troops. After all, tens of thousands of troops are not so easy to defeat. But the commander of the 2nd Division is more concerned about if the experimental subjects can use hot weapons, then the isolated and helpless number 74 fortress will be more difficult in the future siege. I can only hope that the experimental subjects will not drive tanks. The experimental subjects did not pursue, they just watched silently in the mountains and forests with fierce expressions. Meanwhile, a raging fire was still burning in the woods beside the mountain road, spreading further and further away. In the burned areas, only black ashes and ruins remained. When the news of the defeat of the reinforcements reached Fort 74, the residents of the fort were shocked. The most obvious thing was that the porridge in the porridge shed suddenly became very thin, and almost no rice grains could be seen. It was not that Fort 74 had no food, but that Zhou's troops were ready for a protracted war. If the reinforcements could not come, they could only rely on them to continue to defend the fortress, and no one knew how long they would have to defend. When some residents found that there was no rice in the porridge, they immediately started to make a fuss in the porridge shed. They yelled at the people who were distributing the porridge, "Look at how thin the porridge is." As they said that, these people actually overturned the porridge shed. However, After overturning it, the men in charge of distributing the porridge rushed out, holding sticks and started beating people. The few people who overturned the porridge shed were beaten beyond recognition. The men who took action were extremely fierce, and they simply wanted to use these rioters to establish their authority. Soon, a reporter took the photos they had taken to Joe to argue. Joe's answer was that this company was not an industry of the Joe Consortium, but Joe would definitely investigate the matter strictly. An hour later, Joe announced that the attacker had been fired, which was an explanation to the residents. Ren Xiaosu laughed when he heard about this. Before, he was wondering why Joe didn't distribute porridge by himself. It turned out that it was convenient to give an explanation to the media after the beating. After beating up those troublemakers, just fire 2 people at random. This so-called company is purely used to take the blame. This move was not beautiful, and it was even a bit dirty, but no one dared to make trouble at the porridge shed. Even the residents who had made trouble before in the entire barrier settled down. They knew that this time the beating at the porridge shed was just a signal. Joe was impatient, so they didn't come to make trouble themselves. 3 days later, the only thing the residents of the barrier thought about every day was going to the porridge shed to get porridge. A week passed, and there was no new news about the reinforcements. It seemed that Joe's troops were also in trouble and didn't know how to deal with the experimental subjects. The whole fortress seemed to be getting more and more dilapidated. There were few pedestrians on the street. Those who were there were begging for food on the roadside. The trees on the street had no bark, and they were all eaten by people. Joe didn't deliberately not distribute food, but they didn't have much food in stock. Even the rations of Joe's soldiers were reduced. In order to show that he shared the hardships with the troops, Zhou Xingwen moved his food and accommodation into the barracks to show that he didn't have a special meal. Everyone could only get through the difficulties together. Li Ran and others were somewhat fortunate. Fortunately, Ren Xiaosu took Fang Zhi to bribe the officers of the private army and bought some military rations back, otherwise they would have to starve now. However, Ren Xiaosu specifically told them, "Don't go to the hotel kitchen when cooking, there is an air vent there, and close the door tightly to prevent the smell from escaping." All the food was controlled by Fang Zhi, and Ren Xiaosu did not eat or take more than he deserved. Li Ren asked Ren Xiaosu cautiously, "I heard from Fang Zhi that the food we bought this time can only last for 2 days at most. What should we do next? You know, there are too many staff members in their touring team, and even if they buy food, it will not be enough." Ren Xiaosu looked at Li Ran's expectant eyes and shook his head. "I don't know what to do." "Then if there is really no reinforcement, can you and Zhou Yingsu save me out?" Li Ran asked anxiously. Ren Xiaosu glanced at her and replied, "I don't know. There will be more to make up for the missed updates in the evening, but it is still quite late. Friends who go to bed early should not wait, and read it tomorrow morning. Please give me a guaranteed monthly ticket, thank you everyone." Chapter 570 Never Come Back. According to everyone's thinking, Joe will definitely be able to solve the problem of the experimental subject within a week. Since the experimental subject failed to capture the city at the beginning, Joe will not have to take the experimental subject seriously after he reacts. But the reality seems to be different. From the day when the experimental subject first started to attack the city, more than a week has passed, and there is no sign of reinforcements at barrier number 74. When Li Ran and his friends started eating, they did not care about controlling their food intake. Everyone ate as usual, so the food they bought before was quickly used up. Zhou Yingsu said a few words, but everyone thought that they would be able to escape soon, and they would not be able to leave with the food by then, so they might as well finish it. So Zhou Yingsu did not say anything more. Anyway, she would just eat potatoes with a master. What did the life and death of these people have to do with her? At this point, Li Ran and his friends saw that there was no hope of being rescued, and they began to worry about the problem of eating again. But everyone remembered that Zhou Yingsu persuaded them, but they did not listen. They were too embarrassed to ask Zhou Yingsu for help to think of a solution, and Ren Xiaosu was indifferent. He didn't care about them at all and didn't even bother to pay attention to them. Of course, they weren't hungry yet. If they were really hungry, they would probably even eat tree bark, let alone beg for help. But it was hard to say whether there was still tree bark on the street at that time. Anyway, Ren Xiaosu was not panicked at all. He went out every day to check the situation of the city defense and whether there were any experimental subjects attacking. He didn't care about anything else. The food in his storage space was enough for him and Zhou Yingsu to survive for another 3 months, and the food variety was quite rich. There were still 3 wild boars left from the previous pot. 2 days later, Li Ran and others kept thinking that they could smell the faint smell of meat in the hotel, but when they followed the smell, they found nothing. Everyone thought that it might be hallucinations caused by hunger. Until they saw the grease on Zhou Yingsu's lips. Zhou Yingsu didn't feel like she was stealing. Anyway, the pork was given by the master. She didn't steal or rob, and she didn't have the obligation to share it with others, right? On that day, an extremely strange thing happened. Soldiers were lying behind a defensive bunker on the rampart, and they saw an experimental subject crawling over quickly with something hanging in its mouth. Everyone was a little confused. Why did an experimental subject come? Was it here to surrender? Did the experimental subject have an internal conflict? The experimental subject came under the rampart, threw away the food in its mouth, turned around and left, and went back into the dark forest. The defenders on the top of the city looked at each other, and quickly lowered a person in a hanging basket to pick up the things that the experimental subject had thrown away. It was a piece of white cloth. After hearing about this, Zhou Xingwen ran up to the city wall. He took the white cloth from the soldier, and there were a few words written in blood on it: negotiation, come alone. Suddenly, Zhou Xingwen's scalp went numb. This experimental subject could actually write their language, and even used words like negotiation. Humans negotiate with experimental subjects? How to negotiate? Lao Li and Qin Sheng rushed over. The people from the Spark Company, who were originally on the top of the city, explained to them what happened. Lao Li suddenly said, "I'll go." Qin Sheng turned his head and looked at Lao Li. "Teacher, you can't go. There are probably nearly 10,000 experimental subjects in the woods." "Okay." Lao Li shook the white cloth and smiled. "Someone has to go and see what the experimental subject is up to. I have no children, no partner, no worries, and my only apprentice has also graduated. This is the right thing for me to do." None of the officers of the Zhou army next to him spoke. They definitely didn't want to go. Lao Li was willing to stand up, and they admired him from the bottom of their hearts. And seeing that the knight was talking and laughing, he didn't seem to be that scared. Old Li's smile faded, and this experimental subject is obviously controlled by an intelligent life behind the scenes. If the other party negotiates with me and gets close to let me complete the beheading, then the danger of this experimental subject can probably be resolved. As for after the beheading, Old Li will definitely be besieged and killed by the experimental subjects. No matter how powerful he is, he can't fight so many experimental subjects. But he didn't say any of these afterwards. Since he went there, he must be determined to die. Qin Sheng wanted to dissuade him, but he was stopped by Old Li before he could say anything. He smiled and said, "This is very exciting, isn't it?" In the afternoon, Old Li went down directly with a rope and walked slowly towards the forest alone. As soon as he entered the forest, he found that there were experimental subjects moving back and forth around him, surrounding him. The experimental subjects did not attack Old Li, but instead made way for him and walked into the depths of the forest. Old Li stepped on the soft leaves under his feet. After autumn, pieces of leaves fell into the soil and turned into dust. His result would not be much different from these fallen leaves. It was just a matter of time. Thinking of this, Lao Li walked forward with big strides, ignoring the experimental subject beside him. After walking about 2 kilometers, Lao Li saw an experimental subject sitting by the campfire in front of him, holding a branch in his gray palm, and a sparrow stuck on the branch. Lao Li stood still. He looked around silently, wanting to see if there was a chance to kill the other party, but before taking action, he had to listen to what the other party wanted to talk about. But how to talk? Do both parties right? Just as Lao Li was thinking about it, the experimental subject suddenly laughed hoarsely. "I have seen you. You were on the mountain that evening, and there was a boy beside you at that time. Why didn't I see him come?" Lao Li was surprised that the other party could speak. The experimental subject is a human mutation, and it is normal to be able to speak human language, but Lao Li thinks it is very abnormal. The experimental subject's voice was extremely hoarse, like 2 pieces of gauze rubbing against each other. "Don't be too surprised. I am also a human being. We become like this for the purpose of curing diseases. It's just that some people are lucky like me and can gradually regain their sanity, while others unfortunately become monsters." Lao Li frowned and said nothing. The other party's words contained too much information. The experimental subject glanced at him, shook the sparrow in his hand and smiled. "This is for you. I used to like to eat roasted meat, but now I like blood and flesh more, and sometimes I even like to eat some rotten food to change my taste. You just stand there. If you get one step closer, you will die here. Don't try to plot against me. You are not good enough." As he said that, the experimental subject threw the sparrow to Lao Li. Old Li took the sparrow without disdain. He raised his hand to his mouth and tore off a piece of meat. He chewed and asked, "Isn't it good to be a human? Meat tastes better when it's roasted." "This is exactly why I asked you to come here," the experimental subject said hoarsely. "Help me find someone. If I find someone, I will retreat back to the mountains, or I can go further south and never come back." Chapter 571. The person the experiment subject is looking for. We are from the number 039 laboratory of the Spark Company. Before the catastrophe, this laboratory has been committed to researching anti-cancer methods, but some of their drugs are prohibited, and only dying people dare to try them, the experimental subject said slowly. Lao Li wanted to remember every word the other party said in his mind, because this information was too important, and a little less information could lead to some errors later. And what the experimental subject didn't know was that their knights were also looking for the hidden laboratory of the Spark Company, and there were also people they were looking for there. It's just that after the catastrophe, there was too much information missing, and the founder died in the catastrophe. Even the Spark Company and King Group didn't know where the King heir was. The founder left a sentence that his son must still be alive. This matter has almost become the obsession of the knights. As long as they don't find the child one day, they will not be willing to die. Before Lao Li's master died, he only told him one thing, that he must find the heir of the night. Now these words said by the experimental subject made Lao Li's heart beat faster. He suddenly wondered if he and the experimental subject were looking for the same person? Even if it wasn't, then, would the knight's heir also become an experimental subject? Or is this experimental subject in front of him? Lao Li tentatively asked, "Since you have regained your sanity, what did you do before?" "Me." The experimental subject smiled, "The heir of a certain consortium." Lao Li was stunned. "King?" He was going crazy. The descendant of the knight turned into an experimental subject? How could he explain this to other knights? As a result, the experimental subject shook his head and said hoarsely, "I am from the Li family, the consortium before the disaster. I'm afraid you haven't heard of it." At this time, Lao Li suddenly felt so surprised that he wanted to burst into tears. It's good that it's not the experimental subject in front of him. Wait, could it be one of the experimental subjects? Thinking of this, his mood became tangled again, and it was simply twisted. The experimental subject looked at Lao Li and said gloomily, "There are only a few hundred people in the laboratory, from all over the world, who paid a high fee to ask pyrotechnics to treat us dying people. But what pyrotechnics did not say is that their experiment is risky, and even they themselves are not sure that they can cure our diseases. If I really died, it would be fine, but they turned me into this half-human, half-ghost appearance." The experimental subject sneered. "It is said that pyrotechnics is still alive and well now, which is really disappointing." Lao Li asked in confusion, "So you want us to capture the people from pyrotechnics for you so that you can get revenge?" "No," the experimental subject shook his head. "The person I want you to find is a test subject like me, but his disease has been cured." "Even if the disease is cured, can he still be alive after these 200 years? Even if he is very long-lived, he should die of old age?" Lao Li said strangely. The experimental subject asked back, "Am I dead?" Calculating the time, "I am more than 200 years old." "You mean, you have gained eternal life?" Lao Li was shocked again. He felt that the information he received in one day today was enough to shock him for a year. The experimental subject sneered, "You have to ask the Spark Company. They have made us completely carriers of cancer cells. If cancer cells can be immortal, then we can be immortal. Then the person you are looking for." Old Li swallowed. Even though he was knowledgeable, he had never heard of such a thing. The experimental subject said, "He should have escaped from the laboratory not long ago. During an earthquake a few years ago, a crack appeared in the laboratory, and all the imprisoned patients began to recover. However, before the disaster, Spark Company even chained us to prevent us from escaping, so we were trapped there for a long time. The one who escaped was different. As the only one who was truly cured, he was not locked up. After the crack appeared, he also woke up. I screamed and hoped that he could take us back to see the light of day, but I could only listen to his footsteps gradually disappearing." The experimental subject's voice became heavier and heavier, He is different from us. According to Spark Company, he should look no different from a normal person on the surface. Only during testing will it be discovered that each of his cell nuclei is an alien nucleus, but the alien nucleus is extremely regular and neat. Spark Company even calls this kind of cell nucleus a work of art. Lao Li felt his scalp tingling. Is that still a human being? The experimental subject laughed strangely. Of course it is, and Spark Company calls him a more powerful, new human. So what do you want us to help find him? Asked Lao Li. Of course, it's to find a way to cure us, the experimental subject roared. It was extremely irritable after becoming like this. Find him and hand him over to me. As long as you let me find a cure, I will never set foot in Central Plains again. This deal is very cost-effective. If you can't find it, I will make Central Plains my kingdom. When saying this, Lao Li felt that this experimental subject had regarded himself as a king. But you have to give me some clues, Lao Li said. Just knowing that his cells are heteromorphic nuclei, I can't drag everyone in the world to do tests, slice each person a little, and then put them under a microscope to observe? This one is not, well, that one is not. The experimental subject said angrily, I don't have time to gossip with you, go find him. I don't have any clues here, but he will definitely not be mediocre after returning to the human world. Maybe you can ask the Qing family for some clues. If you can't find him, I will massacre the city in 7 days, and no one in that fortress will survive. From beginning to end, the experimental subject did not give Lao Li the opportunity to approach it and behead it, and Lao Li had long lost the intention of beheading it. The amount of information he obtained today was too much, and he had to hurry back to the fortress to discuss with others what to do. And he had to ask the headquarters of the Spark Company to see if they had any information in this regard. Before, they were like headless flies, following the Spark Company to find many laboratories, but there was no trace of the descendants of the Knights. Because of the disaster, Spark Company lost a lot of precious data, and even only 1 in 10 researchers survived. It was lucky that 4 or 5 out of 1,000 researchers survived the disaster. Because of the disaster, the Knights organization lost even the photos of the Knights' descendants. Over the years, they can only rely on word of mouth to describe their appearance. They are pretty good looking. There is no way they can find this person. They do know that the Knight's descendant's name is Ren Xiaosu. If they can find Laboratory 039, they might be able to find the list of the laboratory at that time. The 5th update is over. I finally paid off the chapters I owed. I even feel a little touched. Please give me a monthly ticket. Please give me a monthly ticket. Chapter 572, The Person Not Found. 74 Rampart all stood quietly on the wall, waiting for news from Lao Li. Everyone wanted to know what the experimental subject wanted to talk about. It was always incredible for a ferocious beast to propose negotiations. When Lao Li appeared in everyone's sight, all the defenders on the wall breathed a sigh of relief. At least Lao Li was back safely. Some people even cheered on the top of the wall, as if they were welcoming a lone hero. They were generous with their praise and enthusiasm. It was as if they had won a victory on the wall, completely forgetting that they were still surrounded by the experimental subjects. However, the hero Lao Li himself was not so happy. Instead, he was entangled and confused by the things he just knew, and his mood was a little heavy. The people on the wall were ready to put down the hanging basket to welcome Lao Li, but Lao Li climbed up from the bottom with his bare hands. From a distance, the rampart was very smooth, but from a close distance, there were some fine cracks on it. Everyone saw Lao Li's skillful climbing action on the wall, and it was obvious that it was not the first time he had climbed over the rampart. Zhou Xingwen walked up to Lao Li and asked, "What does the experimental subject want? How did you communicate?" "It can speak human language." Lao Li glanced at the member of the Spark Company next to him, and then told the others truthfully, "These experimental subjects are from the 039 laboratory of the Spark Company, which was originally used to treat cancer patients. As a result, an accident occurred and turned them into this. They are negotiating now, and they want us to help find a person who escaped from that laboratory. They say that the secret of the other party can help cure them and turn them back into normal humans." As soon as these words came out, everyone was stunned. There was too much information contained in such a short sentence. Lao Li looked at the dumbfounded expressions of the crowd and recalled that he was probably in the same state just now. Everyone looked at the members of the Spark Company intentionally or unintentionally, thinking that it turned out that this thing was made by them. Now, the fact that the Spark Company created monsters is confirmed. But now that they are helping to defend the city, the officers of Zhou's troops can't say much, so they can only go back and discuss it privately. The members of the Spark Company had no expression on their faces throughout the whole process. In fact, the experimental subject was created by the Spark Company, which was no longer a secret. At least the Qing family knew it clearly, but the Qing family did not deliberately create public opinion to disgust the Spark Company. At this time, Lao Li sighed, if this person is not found, the experimental subject will come to destroy the city in 7 days. Zhou Xingwen suddenly said, we definitely cannot hand this person over to the experimental subject. First of all, we cannot believe everything they say. The degree of truth needs to be verified. Secondly, it is not clear whether this person can cure the experimental subject. This experimental subject is so cunning and vicious. Even if he is cured, can you get along with him in a friendly manner? There were also people around who agreed, and they all felt that this person could not be handed over to the experimental subject. Only Qin Shen was puzzled and said, it's as if we have found this person. Why do I feel that we may not find him? Zhou Xingwen. Lao Li said, there is really no clue. There is no appearance and age can't be determined. The only information we know is that he came from Lab 039. Qin Shen said the key point. You have to find this person first, and then discuss whether to hand him over. Everyone acted separately. Spark Company contacted the headquarters to feed back the information here. However, Spark Company clearly stated that Lab 039 had been completely destroyed. After the earthquake in Jingshan, the magma of the volcano completely covered the area, and there were unknown creatures there, which were extremely powerful. Even if the creature was lying in the volcano and motionless, the laboratory's data had long been burned by the lava, and it was impossible to find any clues. There may be relevant information in the laboratory and barrier number 73 before. After all, according to some information found before, the research direction of that laboratory and Lab 039 is the same. The two sides should have contacted each other and may leave something. But those materials were all taken away by Wang Konggang. At this point, Spark Company suddenly issued an order to raise Wang Konggang's wanted level. Zhou's troops directly contacted Qing's, and even Zhou Shiji, the leader of Zhou's troops, called Qing Zhen directly, hoping that Qing could provide information in this regard. But Qing said that they knew nothing about it, but they had guessed that these experimental subjects were transformed from cancer patients, and now it has been confirmed. As for the person the experimental subjects were looking for, they didn't know, and it was very likely that they were destroyed along with Barrier 113 and Barrier 112. The earthquake directly destroyed the two barriers, and even if there were any clues, they were probably buried together. Zhou Xingwen was helpless. They were still discussing whether to hand over the person or not, but how could they hand over the person if they couldn't even find the person? Exclamation mark. At this time, they guessed that the patients who successfully cured cancer might be hiding among normal humans, and unless the other party's cells were tested, they would not be able to find the other party at all. Even the experimental subject said that the other party might be the same as a normal person. This matter was eventually published in the Hope Media newspaper. Zhou's troops made this matter public and accepted interviews from the media. They also wanted to use the newspaper to appeal to the experimental subject hidden among humans to come forward. They didn't need to face the experimental subject, but just tell the information they knew. When Ren Xiaosu got the newspaper, he was confused. Laboratory 039. This is consistent with the information he transported by train. There is also a document in the information saying that there are patients with perfect cancer cure in Laboratory 039, but it is difficult to replicate because of the special treatment conditions. So, those experimental subjects are the guinea pigs whose treatment methods failed to be replicated. Looking at the time mentioned in the newspaper, Ren Xiaosu is stunned for a moment. At a certain moment, the unconscious little boy in the snow flashed in his mind. He carried the boy out of the snow, and since then he has a younger brother. Judging from the time and location, Yan Liwen seems to fit the characteristics. Although the time and location are extremely vague, and the experimental subject claimed that it is difficult to calculate the time because he was locked in a dim laboratory, but if we simply calculate it, Yan Liwen is really likely. But Yan Liwen didn't have a strong body. On the contrary, he was weak and sickly because of his wish. That shouldn't be the case, Ren Xiaosu said to himself. But whether Yan Liwen was the number 001 experimental subject or not, Ren Xiaosu would never tell anyone about this. He had seen too many evil things and knew very well what a special human being like this would encounter in society. No matter how kind you are, others will still treat you as an alien in their hearts. Even heroes are like this, let alone others. Chapter 573. There is a balm. 74. I've never felt that 7 days are so long. Usually a week passes in a flash, but now, 7 days feel like 7 years. Lao Li has been worried these days. He contacted other knights and asked if they knew anything or if there was any information that was ignored by everyone. In fact, Lao Li and Qin Sheng are not even that concerned about the war between Barrier 74 and the experimental subjects. For them, guarding Barrier 74 is out of their sense of justice. Just like helping others when seeing injustice, they themselves have no idea of coexisting with Barrier 74. It's not that they don't have the determination to share the same hatred with all mankind, but if they can't defend the city even if they try their best, they won't die here. Everyone says that knights are kind and good people, but that's just that knights have done a lot of things to help people in times of need, and they are remembered. But for them, there are more important things to do. So the words they engraved on the top of the mountain are only faith and the sun and the moon are eternal, not protecting world peace. In the eyes of the knights, world peace is important, but not as important as their beliefs. They are knights' disciples, and of course they have to find the knights' descendants first for the rest of their lives. Lao Li and Qin Sheng kept contacting other knights, trying to confirm whether the person they were looking for was the same as the person the experimental subject was looking for. As a result, after asking for a long time, everyone said that because of the serious loss of information, they only knew that the other party was called Ren Xiaosu, had a pretty face, was in the laboratory of the Spark Company, and must still be alive. This information seems to be a lot, but it is actually very vague. Lao Li and Qin Sheng were sitting cross-legged on a rooftop of the fortress. There was no one around, and Lao Li suddenly said, "Why would the knight's descendants be in the Spark Company laboratory? I couldn't understand it before, and thought that the knight was too unreliable to send his own son to Spark as a guinea pig for research. But now, combined with what the experimental subject said, I understand. The knight's descendants must have also suffered from a terminal illness, so he had no choice but to send his son to Spark Company as his last hope." Qin Sheng nodded seriously. "Teacher, you make sense." Lao Li continued to speculate. The knight said that his son must still be alive. Does that mean that his son's illness has been cured? So, the person the experimental subject is looking for and the person we are looking for are actually the same person. Qin Sheng nodded again. "Teacher, you make sense." Old Li grabbed his hair and said, "But even if we know this, what's the use? Where can we find him? Qing's barrier number 113 and barrier number 112 are buried. It's useless to know that he looks pretty. Otherwise, we should put an advertisement in the newspaper to find Ren Xiaosu. If he sees it, he might come to find us. If you say it again, I will beat you." Qin Sheng said awkwardly, "But if he is discovered by other forces with ulterior motives after the advertisement, then he will be in danger? And now the person from the Spark Company has gone crazy. Who knows what he will think of Ren Xiaosu?" "That's right." Old Li looked at the sky and sighed speechlessly. "It's too hard for me." At the moment, because of the experimental body, the Spark Company was once again pushed to the forefront. People seem to have forgotten that the Spark Company participated in the defense of the city, and turned to attack them for making monsters. Even the defense of the city was speculated to have ulterior motives. The people in barrier number 74 gradually began to reject the Spark Company and no longer informed them of important matters concerning the defense of the city. Before the final battle, humans actually quarreled among themselves. It was sad and ridiculous. The residents in the number 74 fortress had run out of food again. The porridge in the porridge shed might only have dozens of grains of rice in a large pot. After drinking the porridge, everyone was just full of water at most, and they were hungry again in less than an hour. Fortunately, the water in the fortress was not cut off, otherwise many people would have died. The green belts and trees on the roadside had been eaten bare, leaving only bare branches. Some residents of the fortress even hoped that the experimental subjects would come and fight earlier, so that they could be freed earlier. Whether they won or lost, at least there would be a result. Li Ran and his friends had run out of food, but they were worse off than the other residents of the fortress. The other residents were just hungry. They were hungry, but they could still smell the smell of meat every day. This feeling was too cruel. They could smell such a delicious smell, but they couldn't eat it. In the past 2 days, Li Ran went to harass Ren Xiaosu every night, and as a result, Ren Xiaosu didn't go back to the hotel. Then Li Ran went to harass Zhou Yingsu again, and this time he really got food. After all, Zhou Yingsu was not a heartless person. Feng Zhi stood guard at the door and asked her what she had eaten. Li Ran wiped his greasy mouth and said, "I just gave you some potatoes." Then, Li Ran stuffed 5 or 6 potatoes into Feng Zhi's mouth and said, "Share them with everyone. Fill your stomach first." Ren Xiaosu was walking on the street. There were people sitting on the side of the road with signs in front of them saying that they could work for free and just needed to be given some food. This was a more civilized approach. Some people went out to steal or rob directly. In fact, at this time, there was not much difference between the people of the barrier and the refugees. They would do anything when they were forced to this point. Ren Xiaosu usually stayed on the rooftops of some fixed high-rise buildings, not for anything else, but just to prevent another experimental subject from suddenly coming out of a hole in the ground. It was also a contribution to guarding the barrier. At this moment, if the barrier was broken, no one in the city would be spared. However, Ren Xiaosu was thinking about a problem. In fact, the number 001 experimental subject must be very difficult to find. The experimental subject should also be very clear about this. The other party has destroyed so many barriers in the southwest, and should have known that even if it can be found, the number 001 experimental subject cannot reach the number 74 barrier in 7 days. But why did the other party make such a request and give a 7-day deadline? Ren Xiaosu has been accustomed to using the worst possibility to speculate these experimental subjects. After all, the other party's wisdom has long been no different from that of normal people, and even far exceeds that of ordinary humans. Could this negotiation also be a strategy of the other party? At this time, several migrant workers were lazy behind the fortifications beside the barrier wall. They were better off than the people in the barrier. At least they were locked up in the barracks and had porridge to drink. After all, Zhou's troops still wanted them to work. Several migrant workers were chatting and bragging, and suddenly the place where one of them was sitting collapsed. The refugee who fell into the pit was shocked. He thought at that time that it was over. There must be an experimental subject in this pit. This is the experimental subject attacking. After falling in, the black hole did lead to the outside of the barrier, but no experimental subjects were seen inside. He hurriedly got out of the pit and reported the incident to Zhou's troops. A Zhou soldier went down the pit with a military flashlight, but just after walking more than 10 meters, he saw something covered by oilcloth in front of him. He lifted the oilcloth and saw a military ammunition transport box under the oilcloth, which was written, TNT. The Zhou soldier's face gradually became panicked, and he shouted to the people behind him, "There's a bomb." The bomb was just under the foundation of the barrier wall. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 574 There's a Bomb. Knowing that the experimenter would use simple thermal weapons, it was too terrifying to find a bomb in the tunnel. During this period, there were special instruments near the walls of the ramparts to check the decibels, for fear that the sound of the experimenter digging the tunnel would not be detected by them. But this tunnel was probably dug by the experimenter a long time ago, otherwise how could it escape the monitoring of Zhou's troops? The soldier who found the bomb was already panicking. He ran back frantically, but before he could get out of the hole, the bomb behind him suddenly exploded. The soil around the rampart wall seemed to have been plowed by someone in an instant. Huge pieces of soil broke apart, and the ground was like the surface of water, raising waves of soil. The people surrounding the pit were thrown into the sky in just an instant. Their internal organs began to rupture, and in the blink of an eye they died of internal bleeding. But this was just the beginning. There were 3 places like this explosion. The huge roar startled the entire rampart, and the residents all stopped what they were doing and stared blankly at the western rampart wall beginning to collapse. Because of the loss of the foundation, after the explosion, the cracks in the wall continued to spread from bottom to top, and finally collapsed into 3 huge gaps. The 3 explosion points just disintegrated a wall, and fell to the ground together with the defenders on it. At this moment, all heavy machine guns and artillery were useless. The door was already open, and the experimental subjects waiting outside were already ready to move. When Lao Li and Qin Sheng heard the explosion, they had already accelerated towards the wall of the barrier, but before they arrived, they had already seen the wall of the barrier collapse. This was a scene they had never seen with their own eyes, as if human civilization was also collapsing before their eyes. The building that humans relied on to protect themselves for hundreds of years collapsed before their eyes. The huge circular barrier was like a piece of cake, and now a corner was cut off by the experimental subject with a sharp knife. This scene also clearly told humans, your barrier is not as strong as imagined, but it is okay to prevent wild beasts. Following closely behind, densely packed experimental subjects climbed over the ruins of the wall. Lao Li stared at the gray experimental subjects in a daze, like a spider frenzy. Therefore, the negotiations and the 7-day deadline that the experimental subject talked about were all fake. The other party just wanted to make the humans in the barrier take it lightly and distract their attention to find the so-called experimental subject number 001. And they had already planned to launch an attack to destroy the barrier on the second day of the negotiation. What the experimental subject wants is living people and the expansion of its tribe. Lao Li recalled the kingly posture of the experimental subject. In fact, the monster had long been prepared to turn the entire Central Plains into its own territory. The other party may never have thought about becoming an ordinary person. Let's go, Lao Li said in a daze. Qin Sheng was anxious. Are we just leaving like this? Lao Li glanced at Qin Sheng and said seriously, you and I have no obligation to live and die with barrier number 74. Save your strength and save some people. Save as many as you can. Barrier number 74 can no longer be saved. It's not that Lao Li doesn't want to defend, but most of the defenders on the wall of the barrier have been destroyed. War is cruel. Zhou's troops no longer have the strength to stop the experimental subject. Old Li looked back at Qin Sheng. Now only the east gate of the barrier has not been sealed. You take the refugees there. I take them. Qin Sheng was stunned for a moment. What about you, teacher? I'll stop the experimental subjects for a while. I hope I can hold on a little longer. These experimental subjects can't run away from me. Don't worry, said Old Li. What Old Li didn't say was that if no one went to stop the experimental subjects, I'm afraid no one could escape. So many refugees would eventually be swallowed by the experimental subjects. Refugees can't run away from the experimental subjects. However, at this moment, a troop from the rear rushed from the street. Zhou Xingwen sat in the car and looked at Old Li and Qin Sheng calmly. You take the residents to flee to the east. I have notified the garrison to open the east gate. We, the Zhou family, will defend the Zhou family's barrier ourselves. You don't have to die with us. As he spoke, Zhou Xingwen revealed a heroic spirit of facing death with indifference. Before the explosion, he deployed troops at the command center and rushed over immediately after hearing the explosion. He knew very well that there was no hope for this fortress. There were screaming and desperate residents all around him. As the highest commander of this fortress, he should not escape first, but do the last thing, and kill as many experimental subjects as possible. Zhou Xingwen also understood that even if he escaped alive, he would never be able to get rid of the huge self-blame and regret in the future. As he was talking, a red and gray mushroom cloud suddenly rose in the middle of the densely packed experimental subjects. Under the mushroom cloud, a circle of transparent airwaves was spreading to the periphery. The experimental subjects in the explosion range were involuntarily lifted and melted. The mushroom cloud ranged 100 meters in radius. The experimental subjects in the mushroom cloud were immediately vaporized. The power of the explosion was terrifying. Those experimental subjects were crawling inside from the gap in the fortress. They didn't expect that there would be such a sudden bomb exploding among them. As a mushroom cloud rose into the sky, several explosions occurred near the mushroom cloud, but the momentum was far less than that of the mushroom cloud. At this time, Ren Xiaosu ran away after throwing the exploding poker, feeling very excited. The experimental subjects that just rushed into the barrier must have been blown to pieces by him. This time, the bombs were dropped in batches, and it is estimated that a quarter of the experimental subjects were reduced. The mushroom cloud just now was the 47S that Ren Xiaosu had urgently drawn. To be honest, the power of these 47S scared even Ren Xiaosu himself. The experimental subjects that had not yet entered the barrier were also shocked. They hesitated outside the barrier until they received new orders and rushed towards the barrier again. Old Li stared at the mushroom cloud blankly. Is this the bomb dropped by you, Zhou? No, Zhou Xingwen shook his head and said, and then he ordered the Zhou troops to continue moving forward. Although someone helped them deal with some of the experimental subjects, there were still more ahead. Qin Sheng swallowed his saliva. Teacher, this can't be the method of some extraordinary person. Could it be the extraordinary person with the white mask? It's hard to say. Lao Li shook his head. Let's go. At this moment, Ren Xiaosu was running towards the hotel frantically. When he rushed into the hotel gate, he yelled at Zhou Yingsu, Go, 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 go quickly. It will be too late if you don't leave. Zhou Yingsu had heard the explosion a long time ago. When she saw Ren Xiaosu, she followed without hesitation. Ren Xiaosu turned around and looked at Li Ran and others. The experimental subject has already broken in. If you don't want to die, follow up. If you can't follow, I won't go back to save you. Please give me a monthly ticket. Chapter 575 Blasting out a way out. Dense experimental subjects were pouring in from the gap in the western ramparts. The residents of the ramparts were only in panic and despair. To make matters worse, the residents of the ramparts had been hungry for a long time and they couldn't even run. Some people just ran 2 steps and fell to the ground helplessly. Some people looked at the experimental subjects getting closer and closer, and cursed the experimental subjects' mothers in fear, cursing the Zhou army's incompetence, and then they were easily torn to pieces by the experimental subjects, or knocked unconscious and captured alive. In a residential house, a middle-aged man shouted at his parents, Mom and Dad, hurry up and leave, don't wait, the rampart is over. But the old couple looked at each other and said to the child, we can't walk anymore, don't let us drag you down, you can go with your wife and children. The middle-aged man's tears flowed out, he knelt on the ground and kowtowed to his parents several times, but he couldn't say anything. The 2 old people said, I have lived for most of my life, and there is nothing to regret. Go quickly. As they said that, they began to chase the child out. It is hard to find such people in this world. They are so pure in their love for you. It is also hard to find such people who are willing to use their own lives to fulfill your life. However, when the middle-aged man just went out with his wife and children, he saw the oncoming experimental subject. The other party was so fast that they were caught up before they had time to run. Things in the world are so unpredictable. On another street, a man holding a child ran all the way and slapped the windows of the passing cars. Please, take my child away. He is very smart, not picky about food, and easy to raise. The people in the car looked at him. A man in the car did not speak. Just when he wanted to step on the accelerator, the woman in the passenger seat opened the window and took the child from the man's hand. The man cried and thanked them, but at this moment, several people rushed out from nowhere, reached in through the open car window, opened the locked car door from the inside, and pulled the woman and the child out of the car. The man cried and picked up the child, but the child fell out of the car and fell with a bloody head. Good guys, bad guys, old guys, young guys, men, women. The fortress suddenly seemed to have turned into a huge shura field, completely losing order. Ren Xiaosu and Zhou Yingsu ran wildly on the street. They wanted to rob a car, but the car was moving fast at first, but when the crowds got crowded, the speed of the car was not as fast as the speed of a human running, and it could even be targeted by others at any time. Li Ran and others behind him followed closely, and a plain-clothed officer suddenly shouted, Go east, only the east gate is not sealed. You can't get out of other places. Feng Zhi, who was following behind, also said, Yes, we saw it with our own eyes, only the east gate is not sealed. Ren Xiaosu, go to the east gate. In fact, Ren Xiaosu originally planned to do so, but when the plain-clothed officer and Feng Zhi behind him shouted, he suddenly felt something was wrong. The only thing that was not sealed in the entire fortress was the east gate. In fact, almost everyone in the fortress knew about it, but the problem was that the experimental subject also knew it. This time, the experimental subject was very well prepared for the siege. Would such a smart enemy miss such an important thing? Ren Xiaosu suddenly changed direction and said, Let's go north. To the west are the experimental subjects, and there may be experimental subjects to the east. To the north is the heartland of the Central Plains. Even if there are reinforcements, they must come from the north. So Ren Xiaosu chose to go north. But the plain-clothed officer behind him got anxious when he heard Ren Xiaosu say this. How can you go north? Are you stupid? The north gate has long been sealed with concrete. Going there will only lead to a dead end. I don't agree. As soon as he finished speaking, The plainclothed officer saw that Ren Xiaosu ignored him and continued to run north. Ren Xiaosu didn't care whether they agreed or not. He just led the way. Those who followed him would live, and those who didn't would die. It was that simple. The plainclothes officer looked at Ren Xiaosu's back, and he found that the director Mu Wonj immediately followed Ren Xiaosu's footsteps, and Li Ran did the same. Now, everyone followed Ren Xiaosu to run north, and he had no choice but to follow. During this time, Ren Xiaosu had been leading the way. All obstacles that blocked their route were pushed aside by Ren Xiaosu, and the crowd was also separated by him without mercy. This made the people who followed him to escape feel relieved. Moreover, this group of people had potatoes to eat every day. Although not much, their physical strength was much better than that of other residents of the fortress. Before they ran to the northern wall of the fortress, everyone saw that residents on the east side began to run to the west, and they collided with the residents of the fortress who were fleeing to the west side, and all the streets were blocked. Even Li Ran could understand that there must be experimental subjects in the east, otherwise the residents of the fortress in the east would not run here, but they should be far away from the experimental subjects in the east, so they could not see the terrifying gray figure in their field of vision. The plainclothes who had denied Ren Xiaosu before stopped talking. He understood that Ren Xiaosu's choice of the north must not be accidental, and the other party had thought of this step in advance. This was probably something that Zhou's troops had not expected. In the clogged streets, Ren Xiaosu continued to push the crowds away and run to the north. The bewildered residents saw Ren Xiaosu and his group running north and actually followed him. The flow of people in the barrier was like a wave, and Ren Xiaosu at the front was like the crest of the wave. Ren Xiaosu looked back and saw a large number of refugees behind him. At one point, he wanted to use a steam train to carry these people to escape, but what would happen after that? Would he have to face the endless pursuit of the Spark Company after that? Ren Xiaosu was not a saint. He only led this group of people to find a way out. As for whether the people behind him could keep up, that was not something he could consider. When they were about to reach the northern wall of the barrier, Zhou Yingsu looked at the concrete blockade in front of her and felt desperate. This measure used by humans to guard against experimental subjects actually blocked their way out at this time. She turned around and was about to ask her master what to do, when she saw Ren Xiaosu suddenly took out 4 playing cards from nowhere. As the cards shook, she could see that they were 4-6s. "Master, how do we get out?" Zhou Yingsu asked. Ren Xiaosu replied, "Blow it up with a bomb." Zhou Yingsu thought, "Master, you are not going to use the 4-6s in your hand, are you?" Ren Xiaosu, who was running in the front, stuck the 4-6s he had saved on the wall, then turned and ran away. With a loud bang, a big hole was blown out on the gate that was sealed by the barrier. Zhou Yingsu was stunned. "Is this really a bomb?" Exclamation mark. What kind of strange ability does your master have? To be honest, up to now, Zhou Yingsu knew that her master could produce potatoes with strange seeds, and was very good at using sniper rifles. Now she has broadened her horizons again. Ren Xiaosu took the lead and drilled out of the hole in the wall. Because the wall still had a foundation and there were steel bar load-bearing structures in the wall, this small explosion would not cause the entire wall to collapse. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.